In the quiet of this evening, as the soft hum of the world begins to fade and the last traces of daylight settle into a gentle, muted glow, I welcome you back. Tonight, I invite you to join me on a journey that drifts far across the horizons of time, into an age shaped by ambition, immense change, and the quiet footsteps of a ruler who altered the course of a civilization. This is the story of the first emperor of China, and the dawn of the Qin Dynasty. Settle in as you like, letting your breath fall into a smooth, unhurried rhythm. Allow the stillness around you to deepen. Tonight's story unfolds slowly, like ancient silk unrolling in lantern light. It is a tale carried through centuries, whispered in poems, etched in stone, and remembered in the long shadows of towering walls and silent terracotta figures. I speak to you now from that familiar place of calm reflection, as your background historian, guiding you with a soft and steady voice. Together we will wander through mountain passes and river valleys, through palaces humming with quiet authority, and fields where the earliest foundations of a unified China were laid. We will meet the boy who grew into an emperor, the mind behind sweeping reforms, and the ruler whose dreams of unity reshaped an entire landscape. There is something soothing about returning to a world so ancient that its edges seem softened by time. The Qin Dynasty, though brief, glows like a small but powerful ember in the long timeline of history. In its warmth, we will explore moments of determination, innovation, and the quiet human longing to bring order to a fractured realm. Even the empire's greatest monuments, like the first stretches of the Great Wall, seem to breathe with a kind of steady, patient presence under the moonlit sky. As we move into tonight's story, let yourself travel gently with me. Imagine the hush of distant mountains, the slow curl of incense drifting upward from a palace hall, and the steady heartbeat of a civilization gathering itself into something new. Think of the emperor not only as a figure of absolute power, but as a man navigating shadows and pressures we can still feel echoes of today. We will take our time, walking softly through each chapter, letting the past rise up not with urgency but with the calm certainty of something ancient waiting to be discovered once more. And now, in the quiet that settles before the beginning of any great tale, let us drift a little closer to the story of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, and the world he shaped. Part 1. As we drift softly into the first part of tonight's story, I invite you to imagine the world as it was more than 2,000 years ago, when China was not yet a single land but a patchwork of kingdoms, each with its own ambitions, rivalries, and quiet fears. The air in those distant days carried the tension of long battles and shifting alliances, yet if you listen closely beneath it all, you can almost hear the steady pulse of a great transformation drawing nearer. It is into this landscape of uncertainty and possibility that the story of the first emperor begins. I picture myself walking along a quiet path at dusk, the fading light gathering in pale ribbons across the sky. The distant silhouettes of fortified towns rise gently in the haze. This is the period known as the Warring States, a time when 7 great kingdoms struggled for control. Each state guarded its borders with high walls. Each ruler dreamed of guiding all under heaven. Yet for almost 3 centuries, the land remained fractured, like a porcelain vessel waiting for one final, decisive hand to bring its pieces together. In moments like these, I allow myself to slow down and breathe with the rhythm of this ancient world. You may feel it too, a gentle awareness of how the past stretches out like a soft river, curving quietly from one moment to the next. It is in this atmosphere that a child named Jing Ke was born, destined to become the future first emperor, though no one could yet know how far his ambitions would reach. Jing Ke was born in 259 BCE, within the state of Qin, a kingdom tucked along the western edges of the Chinese cultural sphere. Surrounded by tall mountains and rolling plains, Qin had long been seen as a rugged frontier region, slightly removed from the refined heartland to the east. Yet this outsider status had shaped Qin in powerful ways. The people here valued discipline. Their armies trained with unbroken determination. Their laws were strict, precise, and demanding. Under the guidance of reformers like Xiangyang nearly a century earlier, Qin had transformed itself from a quieter Western kingdom into a formidable state that prized order and efficiency above all else. When I think about this time, I imagine cool morning mist drifting over the Qin palace grounds, softening the austere stone walls while young Yingwen took his first steps within. There is something soothing about picturing him not yet as the emperor he would become, but simply as a child moving through long hallways lit by flickering oil lamps, listening to the distant clatter of soldiers drilling in the courtyards beyond. Even from the beginning, his world was one of structure, focus, and expectation. But the path to power for Yingwen was anything but peaceful. His father, King Guangxiang, died when the boy was only 13, and the young prince ascended to the throne long before he was ready. In the early years, regents acted in his name, guiding the kingdom while the young king watched, learned, and quietly absorbed the shifting currents of court politics. Even in these early chapters, whispers traveled through palace corridors, speaking of plots, rivalries, and ambitions that flowed beneath the surface like a slow-moving river. And yet, through all the complexity and tension, I find a certain tranquility in imagining the young king observing everything with calm, unwavering eyes. There is a quiet strength in watching someone learn the world before stepping fully into it. As I recount these early days, I feel the story settling into its rhythm, like a lantern swaying gently in night air. Yingwen matured quickly. By his late teens, he had taken full control of his court, asserting his authority with a firmness that surprised those who underestimated him. He removed corrupt ministers, consolidated his own power, and began shaping Qin toward the final goal that had eluded generations before him, the unification of all the states into a single, harmonious realm. It is almost peaceful to consider how clearly he must have seen this path, even in a world where conflict had become the natural state of things. As I walk through this chapter with you, I imagine that the land itself felt the early stirrings of change. In the fields, farmers tended rows of millet and wheat beneath quiet skies. In the garrisons, soldiers sharpened their blades in anticipation of another campaign. Traders moved from town to town, carrying silk, bronze, salt, and stories of distant kingdoms. Life unfolded with its own steady cadence, even as the future emperor's plans gathered quietly like storm clouds, though without the thunder, simply with the slow, deliberate pressure of inevitability. One of the unique strengths of Qin was its organizational discipline. The reforms of earlier decades had standardized laws, simplified tax systems, and built a society that rewarded merit. In a gentle way, this steady foundation allowed Yingwen to step into leadership with confidence. Even now, as I describe the state of Qin at this moment in history, I can feel the quiet, structured pulse of the land, as if the kingdom itself breathed in long, even intervals. And of course, war had become a familiar presence. Not a sudden explosion of chaos, but something that moved slowly, year after year, shaping borders and shifting balance. Each of the great states dreamed of unification but lacked the final combination of resources, leadership, and strategy. Only Qin, under Yingwen's developing guidance, possessed the unity of purpose to pursue it fully. As our story reaches its final moments for tonight's part, picture the young king standing on a balcony overlooking the Qin capital of Zhanyang. The air is cool. Torches flicker below like clusters of glowing fireflies. In the distance, the faint outlines of mountains stretch beneath the moonlight. He stands not as a boy any longer, but not yet as the first emperor he will become. There is still so much to unfold. So many campaigns. So many reforms. So many decisions that would ripple gently yet powerfully through all of Chinese history. We leave him here for now, poised between youth and destiny, in a moment suspended like quiet breath. Part 2. As we drift a little deeper into the quiet world of early Qin unification, I invite you to settle further into the stillness around you. Let each breath smooth out the edges of your thoughts as we step softly into the next chapter of Yingzheng's rise. The path ahead unfolds not with the rush of battle drums but with the slow, deliberate cadence of a world preparing for transformation. In this part of our journey, the young king begins taking his first decisive steps toward shaping an empire, though the full weight of that destiny still lies quietly beyond the horizon. When I imagine this time, I picture dawn settling over the Qin capital. A pale wash of light touches the tiled rooftops, stretching across courtyards where shadows linger in gentle pools. The city stirs with slow morning routines. A potter kneads clay by feel rather than sight. A scribe unrolls a fresh strip of bamboo to prepare for the day's records. Soldiers begin their training with calm repetition, the soft rhythm of their movements echoing across the palace grounds. In the midst of this emerging day, the young king, now firmly in control of his court, begins to shape his vision for the land beyond Qin's borders. By his late teens, Yingding had removed those who attempted to rule in his name and had taken direct control. His authority was felt quietly at first, a still force rather than a loud one. Ministers who once whispered among themselves now moved with more careful steps. The court, once divided by rival factions, began to settle into a new balance, guided by the king's unwavering focus. There is something calming in imagining this shift, not as a sudden upheaval but as a slow reordering, like stones settling naturally into place along a riverbed. The world beyond the palace, however, remained fractured. The 7 major states continued to exist like isolated islands within a single, restless sea. Qi, Chu, Zhao, Wei, Han, Yang, and Qin. Each had centuries of history behind it. Each bore traditions, heroes, and hopes uniquely its own. Yet the long era of the warring states had worn them down. Their borders were scarred by countless battles. Their resources strained. Their people restless. The land yearned for harmony, even if it did not yet know what form that harmony would take. In the stillness of evening, I sometimes picture the young king studying sprawling maps illuminated only by lantern light. Tall mountains sketched in charcoal curves. Rivers rendered as soft, flowing lines. The names of states written in steady calligraphy. Yingzheng did not see these as distant lands but as threads waiting to be woven into something whole. There is a quiet determination in that image, the kind that does not shout its intentions but breathes them steadily into existence. One of the key strengths of the Qin state during this time was its commitment to legalist principles. These laws were strict, sharply defined, and applied to all regardless of rank or birth. Though they may seem harsh to modern eyes, they formed the backbone of Qin's efficiency. Fields were tended with precision. Armies were organized with unmatched discipline. Roads stretched outward like firm lines of intention, connecting regions that once felt far apart. This structure allowed Qin to grow stronger, not through chaos, but through unwavering focus. In the deep quiet of night, I imagine advisors gathering in the king's chambers, their voices gentle, measured, and careful. They would speak of neighboring states, of shifting alliances, of opportunities arising from the slow exhaustion of Qin's rivals. Yingding listened, not passively, but with the calm intensity of someone already envisioning the final shape of things. His mind, even at a young age, seemed to move like a river carved through stone, slow on the surface yet carrying tremendous force beneath its stillness. The first steps toward unification came not with a dramatic declaration but with subtle preparations. Qin strengthened its armies while maintaining an air of calm inevitability. Weapons forged in Qin were known for their quality, shaped with care by artisans who understood their craft intimately. Generals trained their soldiers to move as one, not through sudden bursts of energy but with synchronized purpose. I like to think of these preparations as a kind of quiet choreography unfolding across the kingdom, each unit practicing movements that would one day reverberate across the entire land. Beyond the military sphere, Yingzheng continued shaping the internal structure of Qin. He reinforced the legalist reforms. He strengthened agricultural production, ensuring that the fields produced enough to support long campaigns. He invested in infrastructure, extending and reinforcing roads that would help armies travel with remarkable speed. Each improvement was a soft press forward, invisible to most, yet carrying profound effects. It is in these unseen shifts that the early seeds of empire were gently planted. As our narrative flows onward, imagine the gentle murmur of a palace corridor at twilight. Servants move quietly with lanterns. Scholars discuss philosophy in hushed tones. Diplomats from other states walk with cautious steps, unsure of the young king's intentions. And somewhere within this vast palace, Yingzheng stands beside a window, gazing toward distant borders. He knows the time for action is approaching. The world outside waits, though it does not yet know for what. The other states sense Qin's rising strength. Some formed alliances, believing unity between them might protect their independence. Others sought peace through negotiation. But the currents of the era had begun to shift. Qin possessed momentum deeper than diplomacy, shaped by decades of preparation and led by a king who saw beyond the boundaries of his own generation. The land moved with him, slowly at first, as if taking cautious steps toward a new identity. Yet in this early stage, nothing was rushed. The first campaigns would come in their own time, unfolding like chapters of a larger story already written in the quiet spaces of Yingzheng's mind. For now, the emphasis remained on strengthening Qin from within, ensuring that when the moment came, the kingdom could stand firm with quiet confidence. As we reach the close of Part 2, picture the young king once more. The moon hangs low outside his chambers. A map lies unfurled before him, edges held down by carved lacquer weights. His hand moves slowly across its surface, tracing the borders that will one day disappear into the outline of a unified China. There is no urgency in his motion, only certainty, a gentle clarity that settles over him like soft night air. We leave him here in this moment of calm anticipation, as the world prepares quietly for the first great steps toward unity. Part 3. As our story settles into its next quiet chapter, the world of the warring states sharpens gently into focus. The land stretches in broad river valleys and shadowed mountain passes, each region carrying its own stories, its own rhythms, its own unspoken hopes for peace. Yet beneath the surface of daily life, a subtle shift has begun. Qin, under the guiding presence of Yingzheng, has started shaping the contours of a future much larger than itself. And though no trumpet announces it, the air seems to hold a faint tremor, a slow gathering of purpose that touches even the most distant corners of the kingdom. When I imagine these early years of Qin expansion, I picture myself standing along the edge of a quiet hillside, watching a wide plain roll outward under soft morning light. Thin trails rise from small villages, where cooking fires flicker gently in the dawn. Farmers move patiently through tidy rows of fields, their steps steady and familiar. Life unfolds with its usual cadence, unaware that the borders around them will soon shift like the lines of a map drawn in drifting sand. There is a serenity in this image, a reminder that great historical change often begins beneath a veil of ordinary days. Yingding, now a young man whose confidence had settled into something firm and unmistakable, understood that Qin's strength was not merely its army but its discipline, its unity, and its clarity of purpose. In a world shaped by centuries of conflict, these qualities made Qin stand apart. While other states struggled with internal rivalries or fears of invasion, Qin moved with a quiet cohesion that felt almost like a single breath drawn deeply before an immense task. It was around this time that the king's advisors began presenting detailed assessments of neighboring states. Their voices were calm, measured, never hurried. They spoke of Han, the small but strategically important state that lay closest to Qin's borders. They spoke of Zhao, proud and battle-tested. They spoke of Wei, a kingdom worn thin by war, and Chu, vast but uneven in its strength. Each report drifted through the palace halls like the subtle hush of distant tides. And through it all, Yingding listened with the still intensity of someone charting the shape of destiny long before touching it. In the evenings, when lanterns glowed softly against polished stone walls, I imagined the king walking slowly through the palace courtyards. The scent of pine smoke and oldwood hangs in the air. Crickets hum in the quiet corners. Beyond the walls of Zhanyang, the faint sounds of the city drift upward. A merchant securing his stall, a guard shifting his spear, the soft clatter of hooves on packed earth. These small, familiar noises form the backdrop to the enormous decisions Yingding is beginning to weigh. The first target of Qin's outward push was the state of Han. Small, vulnerable, and positioned between more powerful neighbors, Han had long lived under the shadow of larger ambitions. Qin's movements toward Han were steady rather than abrupt, like the way a river edge quietly reshapes a bank over many seasons. Roads were extended. Armies positioned. Supplies organized in calm, deliberate fashion. Nothing rushed. Nothing wasted. Even the soldiers remarked on how their preparations felt more like part of a long, practiced ritual than the beginning of a sudden campaign. When conflict finally came, it unfolded with a kind of quiet inevitability. Qin's forces advanced with disciplined precision. Han, stretched thin and lacking unity, struggled to resist. The skirmishes were not thunderous or chaotic, but measured. Step by step, Qin tightened its hold. And though war is never gentle, history remembers these early campaigns as surprisingly swift and orderly, shaped by the efficiency that the Qin state had spent decades refining. I imagine the people of Han watching this gradual approach with uneasy stillness. In small towns, villagers might pause at the sight of distant banners appearing along the horizon. In the capital, officials gathered in dimly lit halls, their voices low as they debated impossible choices. A sense of resignation draped itself over the state like a thin autumn fog. There was no panic, only the slow understanding that Qin's rise had become something unstoppable. When Han finally fell under Qin's influence, the moment did not arrive with fanfare. It was more like a quiet sigh released after years of tension. A border shifted. A new order took root. Yingding had achieved the first step of his long-imagined vision, though outwardly he showed no triumph, only calm readiness for what would follow. There was still much land to unify, and he carried that awareness with the steady patience of someone walking a long road one softened step at a time. Yet with Han subdued, something subtle changed across the land. The other states felt Qin's presence not as a distant rumor but as a growing force drawing closer. Envoys exchanged anxious glances. Alliances were reconsidered. Diplomats from Qi and Zhao approached Qin nervously, arriving at the capital with gifts, messages, and carefully crafted smiles. Their robes brushed against polished stone floors as they bowed in the great hall, hoping to read the intentions behind the young king's calm expression. Through it all, Yingdeng remained composed, his vision unclouded by flattery or fear. He saw these gestures for what they were, attempts to slow what had already begun. Yet he accepted them with courtesy, never revealing the quiet momentum guiding his decisions. His approach was not reckless, nor was it hurried. It was deliberate, methodical, and shaped by the understanding that unification would require not only strength, but timing, patience, and unwavering resolve. As Qin absorbed Han's territory, new roads were constructed, linking the region more tightly to the Qin heartland. Officials trained under Qin law were sent to administer the newly acquired lands. Farmland was surveyed and reorganized. Fields that had once felt distant from the Qin capital now felt gently bound to it through shared standards and familiar practices. In this quiet administrative work, the foundations of empire deepened, almost like roots weaving into soil unnoticed. I sometimes picture a single moment in this period, a small, easily overlooked scene. A Qin official sits at a wooden desk in a former Han town, copying legal statutes onto bamboo slips. Outside, children chase one another through the dusty street, their laughter blending with the soft clink of a blacksmith's tools. The rhythm of daily life resumes, folding itself into new patterns with remarkable calm. Change, even extraordinary change, often feels invisible when viewed from the level of ordinary days. And so we end this part of our story with Qin's first great step completed. The young king now stands at the threshold of something far greater. A single state has quietly fallen into place beneath his growing domain, and the vast tapestry of the remaining kingdoms stretches before him like a landscape waiting for patient hands to bring it into harmony. The hills grow quiet. Lanterns glow across the capital. A calm night settles over the land as the future deepens its roots in silence. Part 4. As the story opens once more before me, I can almost feel the land breathing with a slow, uncertain rhythm. The fall of Han had shifted the balance of the world in a way that no one could ignore, though many tried to pretend otherwise. Across the kingdoms, whispers drifted through markets, court halls, and quiet family homes. Qin had made its first decisive move, and the air carried the gentle weight of anticipation. Yet even with this subtle tension, ordinary life continued in soft, familiar patterns. A potter still shaped clay by the riverside. A farmer still led his ox across fields washed in morning haze. The world moved on, not realizing that each quiet moment carried it closer to unification. For Yingdeng, the moment after Han's submission was not one of celebration but of contemplation. His gaze turned naturally toward the next major kingdom, Zhao. Zhao was a proud and resilient state, hardened by years of conflicts and remembered as one of the strongest military forces of its era. Yet beneath that outer strength, Zhao had endured wounds that had never fully healed. Long before Yingdeng's rise, Zhao had suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Changping, where an enormous portion of its army had been lost. That loss lingered in the kingdom like a shadow that stretched across generations. In the stillness of these reflections, I imagine the king walking along a garden path at dusk. The soft fragrance of plum blossoms drifts in the air around him. Lanterns glow with muted warmth along the palace walls. Servants move with quiet footsteps, careful not to disturb his thoughts. Ling Ying pauses near the edge of a pond, watching the surface shimmer under the first touch of moonlight. his thoughts settle on Zhao, on its vulnerabilities, on the careful timing required for what must come next. Nothing about his planning is rushed. His decisions unfold like the slow unfurling of a scroll, every movement purposeful. Across the land in the Zhao capital of Handan, a different kind of atmosphere swirls. Court officials gather in chambers lit by flickering torches, their voices uneasy as they discuss Qin's growing influence. They remember the earlier war with Qin. They remember the suffering at Changping. Even the common people feel a faint tremor of dread, though they speak about it softly while preparing evening meals or sweeping dirt courtyards. Zhao was strong, yes, but Qin's strength had become something steady, something that pressed outward with a quiet certainty. Yet the unfolding confrontation between Qin and Zhao began not with swords, but with a tense political gesture. Zhao had once taken the young Yingling hostage during his childhood years in Handan. Though he eventually returned to Qin and became king, the memory of those days remained deeply personal. Old grievances lingered, woven into the political currents of the time. The presence of hostages was not unusual among warring states, but for Yingling, this had shaped his view of Zhao in ways few advisors fully understood. And so a strange moment arose, delicate and filled with quiet tension. Qin sent envoys to Zhao under the pretext of diplomacy. Qin requested that Zhao send their crown prince as a hostage to demonstrate good faith. Zhao refused. The refusal itself might seem small, just a single decision in a long chain of political exchanges. But in the background of history, some moments carry deeper echoes. This was one of them. The denial became a turning point, a subtle shift that began steering the two states toward conflict. In this early stage, I find myself drifting into the landscape that stretched between the two kingdoms. The roads carrying travelers, merchants, and soldiers. The mountain passes that held the quiet cold of winter. The farmlands where the soil, worked by countless hands, waited for the next season. All these places existed in a kind of suspended calm, unaware of the weight of decisions being made far away in royal courts. The tension deepened when Zhao sought aid from its ally, the state of Wei. But Wei, sensing the changing winds, hesitated. Their support came slowly, with reluctance, and with far less force than Zhao needed. This hesitation flickered like a dimming lantern in Zhao's darkest hours. Yingling, watching from the west, understood what this meant. A kingdom once unshakable now stood on uncertain foundations. In preparation for what lay ahead, Qin mobilized its forces once more. Generals gathered troops with the same steady discipline that had brought swift success against Han. Armor was checked, polished, and fitted piece by piece. Bows were strung. Spears stood in neat rows like silent forests of iron and wood. And the soldiers, hardened by Qin's unforgiving training, moved with coordinated purpose. These preparations were not loud or hurried. They unfolded in the same quiet rhythm that defined all of Qin's actions during this era. Meanwhile, in Handan, the tension grew heavier. The Zhao king struggled to balance pride with fear. His advisors urged caution. His generals urged resistance. And across the city, ordinary people whispered in markets and alleyways, wondering whether Qin's shadow would soon stretch over their homes. I imagine mothers holding their children a little closer, artisans working longer at their craft to calm their thoughts, and elders sitting in the fading daylight, recalling stories of past battles and praying for peace. The confrontation between Qin and Zhao eventually crystallized into a major campaign. Though full-scale war had not yet erupted, each side tested the other with strategic movements that revealed more than speeches ever could. Qin's precision and readiness became impossible to ignore. Zhao's vulnerabilities, once manageable, now lay bare. The land seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the first leaf to fall before a long winter. Yet even in this tense atmosphere, life persisted in quiet, enduring ways. A shepherd tended his flock along the foothills. A scholar recited passages of ancient texts to a circle of attentive students. A fisherman cast his net into a calm river, the ripples spreading outward in soft rings. I linger in these gentle images because they remind me that history unfolds not only through battles and kings, but through the steady rhythm of countless small lives that continue regardless of the storms above them. As the final days of fragile peace slipped across the land, Qin stood poised for its next decisive move. Ding, thoughtful and unshaken, held his vision steadily before him. Zhao, once proud and formidable, braced itself with quiet desperation. The faint glow of torches across mountain passes and city walls signaled the approach of change, like the first subtle shift of wind before the arrival of a distant storm. And as night settled over both kingdoms, a stillness unfolded that felt deeper than silence itself, as though the world were pausing at the edge of a turning point it could not yet name. Part 5. In the quiet unfolding of this next chapter, I can almost feel the land stretching beneath a pale sky, its contours softened by early light. The tension between Qin and Zhao has deepened now, settling over the region like a fine layer of frost. It is not yet the furious clash of armies, but something quieter and more deliberate. A slow drawing of breath before a long exhale. A gathering of forces and resolve. And as I let myself drift into this moment of stillness before conflict, I picture the landscape itself holding that same suspended breath, waiting. In the Qin capital of Zhanyang, preparations move with the same measured rhythm that characterizes every aspect of Yingzong's reign. Soldiers rise at dawn. They practice their formations under a soft wash of morning light, the calm precision of their movements creating patterns across packed earth. Their armor glints faintly as they turn, shift, and realign. There is no shouting, no frenzy, only quiet focus. Across the palace, scribes record provisions. Messengers enter and exit with scrolls sealed in wax. Blacksmiths hammer steadily in their forges, the rhythm of metal against metal spreading like a gentle pulse through the air. I imagine the young king observing these preparations from a balcony overlooking the courtyards. His expression calm. His thoughts firm. His mind shaped by years of watching, learning, and waiting. He sees not just the soldiers before him but the shape of the campaign ahead, its angles, its timing, its long-term consequences. Yingzong's strength in these early years lies not in impulsive force but in patient clarity. Each action he orders is deliberate, each decision part of a larger vision that few around him fully comprehend. Across the land in Zhao, a very different atmosphere settles. The capital city of Handan bears the weight of approaching conflict with a quiet unease. Streets that once bustled with daily life now feel subdued. Merchants speak in hushed tones. Children play but pause at the sight of soldiers passing by. The Zhao court struggles to maintain composure, yet its tension bleeds through every corridor and courtyard. Advisors gather late into the night, their conversations drifting through dim halls lit by flickering torches. Their worry, though unspoken, clings to the air like mist. Zhao had been one of the strongest states for generations, shaped by notable generals and a proud military tradition. Yet the memory of Changping, that devastating defeat at Qin's hands decades earlier, lingers like a hidden wound. Entire families still recount the names of lost sons and fathers, their absence felt in the rhythm of daily life. That collective memory softens Zhao's confidence, leaving behind a subtle tremor of doubt beneath its proud exterior. As I walk through this chapter in my mind, I picture the ordinary people across both kingdoms, living through the quiet before war. A grandmother preparing food beside a low hearth, stirring a pot slowly as though movement itself brings comfort. A pair of travelers speaking softly as they share a simple meal along a dusty roadside. Farmers tending their winter fields, bundled in layers of cloth, eyes occasionally drifting toward distant roads that might soon echo with marching footsteps. Their lives continue, steady and unadorned, yet softly colored by the possibility of change. Within Qin's strategic planning, one figure stands out during this time, the General Wang Jian. Known for his caution, patience, and profound understanding of warfare, Wang Jian moves with the same calm deliberation that characterizes Qin itself. He studies maps, assesses terrain, weighs the strengths and weaknesses of Zhao's defenses. His strategy emphasizes slow pressure rather than sudden assault. Cut supply lines. Wear down the enemy. Advance with quiet precision. I imagine him seated at a wooden table, lantern-light casting a soft glow on the lines of the map before him, his eyes steady as he contemplates the path ahead. The campaign against Zhao begins not with a single clash, but with a series of calculated maneuvers. Qin's forces move through border regions like a patient hand shaping clay. Step by step, they press deeper into Zhao territory. Outposts fall quietly. Supply routes become strained. Zhao's armies, though valiant, begin to feel the weight of a campaign that stretches their resources and their endurance. The rhythm of battle at this stage is not thunderous, but measured. A steady tightening rather than a sudden blow. I imagine the experience of a soldier on the Zhao side, standing along a ridge at dawn. The air crisp. The fields below tinged with frost. He watches Qin formations adjusting their positions, their movements calm and disciplined. A soft breeze carries the faint scent of pine from the nearby woods. He grips his spear and breathes slowly, feeling both fear and determination mingling within him. In that moment, he is not thinking of unification or destiny, only of home, of family, of the simple hope of returning safely when the conflict ends. Inside the Zhao palace, the mood grows more strained as messengers arrive with increasingly concerning reports. The king consults with advisors who offer conflicting suggestions. Some call for immediate reinforcements. Others argue for negotiation. Still others believe that yielding certain territories might buy time. I picture their shadows stretching across stone floors as they pace, their robes trailing behind them in slow, restless patterns. As Qin's forces draw nearer to Handan, the weight of the campaign begins pressing into the daily rhythms of the city. People gather around small fires at night, listening for distant sounds. The crackle of flames, the gentle rustle of cloth, the low murmur of quiet conversations all blend into a subdued nighttime soundtrack. There is fear, yes, but also a certain stillness of acceptance, as though the city understands it is standing at a crossroads it can no longer avoid. Meanwhile, in Qin, Yingting receives word of steady progress. His generals send reports written with calm precision, each describing controlled advances and strategic gains. The king reads these documents with a kind of silent composure. He feels the gravity of the moment, yet he moves through it with the same steady determination he has shown since youth. The approaching conquest of Zhao is not simply another victory. It is a necessary step in a larger design, one that will reshape the land into something unified, ordered, and enduring. And so, the quiet tightening continues. The distance between Qin's disciplined forces and Zhao's weary defenses grows smaller with each passing day. The campaign moves not in bursts of fury but in slow, deliberate arcs, shaped by strategy that values patience over spectacle. In these quiet maneuvers, the outcome begins to take shape long before the final confrontation arrives. Across the winter landscape, the wind moves softly through bare trees. Frost clings to roof tiles. Lanterns glow faintly in village windows as families gather close against the cold. These gentle details exist alongside the broader sweep of history, each illuminating the human world within the larger story. And beneath it all, the land itself seems to wait, calm, observant, and quietly aware that the balance of power is shifting with each measured step taken across its soil. Part 6. In this next quiet chapter, the world around Qin and Zhao feels suspended in a delicate stillness, as though the land itself understands that a decisive moment draws near. The campaign that began with slow pressure now deepens into something more resolute. Qin's steady advance continues its silent tightening, and Handan, the proud capital of Zhao, feels its breath grow shorter with each passing day. Yet even under this gathering weight, the rhythms of ordinary life persist in soft, steady patterns, reminding me that history's greatest turning points are often wrapped inside the simplest moments. I imagine the early morning light over the Zhao countryside, pale and cool, brushing the rooftops of small farm villages. Smoke curls upward from cooking fires. The soft bleating of goats drifts across frost-dusted fields. A child runs along a narrow dirt path, breath puffing in little clouds, unaware of the armies positioning themselves just beyond the horizon. These small scenes hold their own kind of quiet truth, gently anchoring the unfolding of larger, more turbulent events. As Qin's forces push deeper into Zhao territory, the defensive lines that once seemed strong now strained under the burden of exhaustion. Supply shortages grew more serious. Communication became erratic. And the soldiers, though brave, felt the slow erosion of morale that comes when the ground beneath one's feet begins to feel less certain each day. Even the commanders of Zhao, seasoned by years of warfare, understood the narrowing options before them. Yet the struggle for Zhao did not unfold without complexity. The kingdom's most famous general, Li Mu, had once proven remarkably capable of defending its borders. Wise, cautious, and deeply respected by the soldiers, Li Mu had held Qin at bay in earlier years. But Zhao's court, worn down by internal divisions and political distrust, eventually removed him under suspicion stirred by Qin's subtle manipulation. In his place, less experienced commanders took charge, their strategies fragmented and unsure. It was a quiet turning point, the kind that reshapes the fate of a kingdom not through a single dramatic moment, but through the gradual unraveling of a steady hand. I imagine Li Mu in those days after his dismissal, sitting by a small brazier as embers glow softly beneath a winter sky. His armor rests unused beside him. His sword lies sheathed. Perhaps he reflects on the years he gave to Zhao, the borders he defended, the soldiers who trusted him. There is a stillness in this image, tinged with melancholy, as though he can feel the distant tremors of a land being pushed toward outcomes he can no longer influence. With Li Mu gone, Qin's forces advanced more confidently. Commanders like Wang Jian and Wang Ben moved with clear purpose, applying gentle yet unyielding pressure to Zhao's weakening defenses. They understood that victory lay not in sudden fury, but in steady constriction, drawing in the opposing forces until resistance thinned like stretched cloth. Each move was calculated. Each step deliberate. Each decision part of a long, unfolding pattern. Inside Handan's walls, fear settled deeper into the stone corridors of the palace. Courtiers whispered anxiously behind screens. Advisors debated long into the night, their voices rising, then falling, then dissolving into frustrated silence. The Zhao king paced alone, listening to the echoes of his footsteps as he weighed options that grew fewer with each report delivered by trembling messengers. Beyond the palace, in the narrow streets where lanterns glowed in gentle amber hues, people sought reassurance in familiar routines. A baker kneaded dough in the chilly dawn. A weaver continued threading her loom, fingers brushing the fibers with instinctive care. Families lit their evening fires and shared simple meals, speaking quietly, glancing now and then toward the northern gates. They did not know when Qin would arrive, only that its coming drew nearer like a slow, steady tide. As Qin encircled Handan, the winter deepened. Snow fell in soft, hushed layers across the region, muffling sounds and softening the harsh edges of war. I pictured Qin's soldiers on night watch, breath forming pale clouds beneath their helmets, their silhouettes still against the backdrop of snow-covered earth. They stand with a kind of patient endurance, waiting for the moment when the city's final resistance will fade. Nearby, campfires crackle gently, sparks lifting into the quiet air before drifting into darkness. Inside the besieged city, the strain became palpable. Food supplies dwindled. Families rationed small portions of grain, stretching each meal as long as possible. The wealthy felt hunger for the first time. The poor felt it deepen with each day. Children slept longer, their bodies conserving energy. The markets emptied until only a few bundled merchants remained, selling whatever they could salvage. Even the animals sensed the tension, moving with slower steps, ears alert to distant echoes beyond the walls. Yet in these strained days, moments of humanity persisted. A soldier shared a handful of chestnuts with a frightened child. Neighbors gathered to patch a damaged roof before snow seeped in. A young woman sang softly to her aging mother, her voice carrying faintly through the brittle winter air. These gentle scenes of care thread themselves through the broader story, reminding me how resilience often lives in quiet acts rather than grand gestures. The final breach of Zhao came not through a single overwhelming blow, but through gradual erosion. Weakened leadership, strained resources, and Qin's relentless pressure finally converged. As Handan fell, the kingdom's long history, its royal line, its proud military tradition, its people's enduring spirit, met a moment that reshaped everything. The city, once vibrant and formidable, now lay beneath Qin's shadow. I imagine the moment Qin forces entered Handan, the sound of disciplined footsteps echoing through streets layered with frost. The distant flutter of banners catching the cold wind. The muted murmurs of citizens peering from behind shuttered windows, unsure whether fear or relief filled their hearts. The soldiers moved quietly, their discipline unchanged, their purpose unshaken. With the fall of Zhao, Qin's path toward unification widened significantly. The kingdom that had once stood as one of the greatest obstacles to Yingveng's vision now folded into the expanding realm of the West. The consequences of this moment rippled outward in ways both subtle and profound, touching the fates of merchants, farmers, nobles, soldiers, and children alike. And as winter settled fully across the land, Zhao's long chapter in the Warring States era drew to a close. The snows lay gently over Handan's rooftops. Lanterns flickered softly in the remaining homes. And the world, quieter now, seemed to absorb the weight of a kingdom's passing with a slow, contemplative breath. Part 7. The quiet after Zhao's fall spread across the land with a strange, subdued stillness, the kind that settles when a long struggle reaches its inevitable close. Yet this stillness was not peace. It was more like the soft hush that follows the extinguishing of a lantern, where the air feels momentarily suspended between darkness and the faint memory of light. The kingdom of Zhao had stood for centuries, enduring wars, hardships, and shifting tides of fortune. Now, absorbed into Qin, its absence left a subtle echo, one that carried through valleys, villages, and the hearts of people who had called it home. In the Qin capital of Zhanyang, this victory did not bring exuberance or noise. The Qin way was quieter, steadier. Part of that quiet came from Yingvang himself. The young king, now further along his path of unification, received word of Zhao's fall with composed reflection. He understood deeply that each conquest carried not only triumph but responsibility, and the weight of governing new land settled into his thoughts with calm clarity. I imagine him in his private study, lantern light flickering across the surface of a map. His eyes trace the newly extended borders, not with pride, but with measured consideration. So much of what he envisioned remained ahead. Meanwhile, in the lands that once formed Zhao, life slowly began to rearrange itself. Qin administrators, trained in the strict and orderly methods of legalist governance, arrived to establish new systems of law and taxation. They carried with them bamboo scrolls, inked directives, tools for measuring land, and a quiet sense of purpose. Their presence was firm, but not chaotic. They moved through the captured territories with a calm understanding that stability must be built steadily, like lowering stone after stone into place. The people of Zhao, though weary and uncertain, gradually adapted to their new rulers. Farmers continued to till soil that had fed their families for generations. Blacksmiths returned to their forges. Merchants hesitantly reopened their stalls, the scent of steamed buns and roasted chestnuts drifting once again through the market streets. Children played in quiet courtyards, their laughter coming softly at first, then more freely as days stretched into weeks. A sense of normalcy, fragile but real, began to settle over the land like a thin layer of morning mist. Yet even as life resumed in these small rhythms, the remaining states watched Qin with deepening concern. Wei, Chu, Yang, and Qi found themselves standing within a world whose balance shifted with every move of the Qin armies. Each kingdom knew it would soon need to decide whether to resist, negotiate, or hope for time that no longer existed. Diplomats traveled the roads between capitals, their caravans moving through mountain passes and along rivers with the weight of delicate messages tucked into lacquered scroll cases. In the quiet corners of state halls, kings and ministers spoke in low, tense voices about the inevitability of Qin's approach. For Qin, the next focus became the state of Wei, positioned between the lands of Zhao and the rich territories to the east. Wei had once been a formidable power, home to skilled generals and respected scholars. But by this stage in the Warring States era, the kingdom had been weakened by years of conflict and political strain. Its defenses, though still present, no longer carried the certainty they once held. Its people, weary from decades of shifting alliances and duties, sensed the gentle but unmistakable pull of Qin's expanding influence. I picture the Wei capital of Daliang during this uncertain time. The city, surrounded by waterways and fertile plains, held a classical beauty shaped by centuries of culture. Tall gates rose above broad streets. Scholars strolled near the walls of famous academies. The scent of baked millet and warm tea drifted through the morning air. But beneath these familiar scenes, the people felt tension gathering like storm clouds on a distant horizon. News from Zhao traveled quickly. It was impossible to ignore the quiet but persistent realization that Wei now stood directly in Qin's path. Yingzheng understood this as well. He saw Wei not only as a necessary part of his expanding realm, but as a strategic crossroads. To reach the eastern states, Qin needed secure passage through Wei's heartland. Thus began a series of calculated movements. Qin forces, led by experienced commanders, advanced with their usual discipline, never rushing, never revealing more than needed. Their formations moved like carefully placed brushstrokes across parchment, shaping the course of the campaign with deliberate clarity. In the Wei countryside, the people carried on with their daily tasks under a growing sense of unease. A fisherman cast his nets into calm water at dawn, watching ripples spread toward reeds along the bank. A seamstress listened to distant travelers discussing the approach of Qin forces while she stitched a garment beneath afternoon light. An elderly man swept fallen leaves from the steps of a small family shrine, pausing now and then to look toward the road with a quiet sigh. These moments exist like small lanterns within the larger flow of history, their gentle glow reminding me how human life continues even when kingdoms tremble. As Qin advanced, the Wei leadership attempted to negotiate, sending envoys to Xianyang in hopes of moderating the inevitable. They offered tribute. They offered assurances. They offered gestures meant to slow the momentum. But Qin's patience was shaped by purpose, not persuasion. Lingang accepted the envoys politely, yet his intentions remained unchanged. The unification of the land was not simply a strategic ambition for him. It had become an internal truth, a vision woven tightly into his understanding of what the future should be. The campaign against Wei intensified, though not in sudden bursts. Qin forces applied pressure at key locations, cutting off supply routes and taking smaller towns one by one. Each quiet victory tightened the boundary around Wei's control. The people of the countryside watched these shifts with a calm that held both fear and acceptance. They had weathered so many conflicts over the years that the sight of soldiers moving through distant fields felt almost like the passing of yet another season. Inside the Wei capital, however, the mood was tense. Ministers gathered around maps, pointing to borders that shrank a little more each week. The king listened with growing anxiety, understanding that the negotiations he sent forth had not slowed Qin's steady advance. I imagine him gazing out from a palace balcony at dusk, watching the red glow of the setting sun soften into blue shadows across rooftops. The air feels heavy. The city feels quiet. And somewhere deep within, he knows that history is shifting beyond his grasp. Qin's encirclement of Wei grew more complete as winter approached. The sound of distant construction echoed across the countryside as Qin engineers built roads and fortified positions. Soldiers rotated through watch posts. Horses whickered softly in frost-covered camps. The days shortened. And with each passing week, the boundary around Wei tightened like a calm, methodical embrace. As the final moments of Wei's resistance drew nearer, the land around Daliang seemed unusually still. The river ran slowly under a pale sky. Reeds swayed in a gentle wind. Lanterns glimmered behind shuttered windows. These small details of quiet life filled the world even as the kingdom's fate hung in the balance. And in that stillness, the delicate line separating uncertainty from inevitability finally began to fade, leaving only the soft hum of a world preparing to accept a new order. Part 8. In the soft quiet that follows the tightening of Qin's hold on Wei, the land seems to breathe with a long, subdued exhale. The once powerful kingdom now stands on unsteady ground, and the world around it absorbs this shift with a calm, reflective hush. Yet even as Wei's walls weaken and its borders shrink beneath Qin's deliberate pressure, life across the region continues in its slow and familiar rhythm. Morning mist still drapes itself over fields. Merchants still open the shutters of their shops. Farmers still guide their oxen across damp soil. The foundations of daily life persist, even as history leans steadily toward transformation. As Qin's forces encroached with measured certainty, the kingdom of Wei reached its most vulnerable moment. The capital, Daliang, sat encircled by marshes and waterways that had once protected it. Its walls were tall, its gates strong, but its leadership carried the weight of exhaustion, and its people felt the strain of an era drawing to a close. I picture the streets of Daliang at dawn, where faint outlines of citizens emerge in the pale light. A woman folds cloth outside her stall. A child fills a bucket at a public well. A fisherman pulls his small boat along the bank, the oars dipping quietly into water. These are the moments that reveal the resilience of ordinary life, moments that continue even when a kingdom stands on the edge of surrender. Inside the palace, however, the atmosphere trembled with uncertainty. Ministers debated with urgent whispers. The king listened with eyes clouded by worry. Reports from the front lines arrived daily, detailing each new loss or retreat. The realization grew heavier with every message: their strength was no longer enough to hold Qin at bay. Negotiations had failed. Alliances had weakened. And even the defensive advantage of Daliang's marshes could not compensate for the depleted state of its armies. Meanwhile, in the Qin encampment surrounding the region, preparations unfolded with the same quiet discipline that defined every aspect of Yingveng's military campaigns. Soldiers checked their equipment in the cool morning light. Strategists studied maps in lantern-lit tents. Commanders walked slowly among their ranks, offering calm instructions and steady reassurance. There was no urgency in their movements, no frantic energy. Instead, a deep confidence filled the air, born from years of preparation and the unshakable momentum that had carried Qin through earlier victories. One of the most significant developments in the campaign against Wei came from the mind of General Wang Ben, the skilled son of the esteemed General Wang Jian. Wang Ben studied the unique geography surrounding Daliang and recognized that its marshes, long considered an unassailable defense, could be turned into a quiet vulnerability. I imagine him standing beside a broad table layered with detailed maps, his fingers tracing the waterways and embankments. His thoughts move with precision. His strategy forms slowly, like ink spreading across paper. Wang Ben proposed redirecting the waters of the Yellow River and the Hong Canal to flood Daliang. This idea was not born from haste or cruelty, but from the understanding that a prolonged siege would cost countless lives on both sides. By using the land itself to weaken the city, Qin could bring the conflict to a quicker close. Yet the consequences would reach far beyond military calculations. Flooding meant destruction. It meant a dramatic reshaping of the landscape. It meant forcing the city into submission through the slow, inevitable rise of water. Yingzheng approved the plan. The king understood the necessity of swift resolution. He also understood the burden of the decision. I picture him sitting quietly in his chambers after giving his assent, the lantern light catching the carved edges of the table beside him. His expression calm. His hand still. Another step toward unification, but one that weighed heavily in the private spaces of his mind. The Qin army worked with quiet efficiency. Engineers broke embankments and built new channels. Soldiers moved earth with disciplined rhythm. Water began to shift course, slowly at first, like a small whisper of movement across damp soil. Then, as days passed, the redirected flow gathered strength. Marshes swelled. Floodwaters crept toward the walls of Daliang. I imagine villagers miles away watching the waterline rise with a mixture of confusion and dread, unaware of the greater strategy unfolding. Inside Daliang, the first signs of flooding brought a ripple of fear. At the city's edges, water seeped into lower streets. Wooden carts floated from their resting places. Families climbed to higher ground, gathering belongings with urgent hands. The sky remained calm, with no storm to blame. The people soon understood the truth: this was not nature's doing, but Qin's. The floodwaters rose with slow, relentless certainty. Each day, they climbed a little higher. Houses filled with muddy water. Market stalls bobbed against their foundations. Boats once used for fishing now carried families from one rooftop to another. The sound of rippling water became an uneasy constant, echoing across streets that had once been warm with familiar noise. I picture the king of Wei standing on a high terrace, overlooking his inundated capital. The wind is faint, stirring the edges of his robe. The sky is dim with late afternoon haze. Below him, the city sinks beneath the quiet force of redirected rivers. The realization that his kingdom cannot endure presses into him with unmistakable clarity. There is no longer a path to resistance, only the slow acceptance of loss. When the waters rose high enough to break the city's remaining resolve, Daliang surrendered. Qin troops entered with their usual measured discipline, moving through flooded streets and half-submerged doorways. They did not rush. They did not revel. Their presence felt more like the steady conclusion of a long process rather than the climax of a single moment. Reports of the fall of Wei reached Yingzheng soon after. The king listened with composed attentiveness, absorbing both the significance and the cost. Another piece of the fractured land had been drawn into his expanding realm. Another step toward unification had been taken. Yet I imagine he felt the weight of the flooding deeply, aware that such decisions, though necessary for his vision, carved lasting marks on the lives of countless people. With Wei now under Qin control, the shape of the map changed once again. The eastern kingdoms felt the shift like the subtle tremor of a distant quake. The land grew quieter in the days that followed, as though the world itself paused to reflect on the fall of a kingdom that had once held great influence. And in that calm, reflective quiet, the rivers receded slowly from the soaked earth of Daliang, leaving behind a landscape forever altered by the deliberate hand of history. Part 9. In the quiet that settled after the fall of Wei, the land seemed to exhale once again, as though each conquest by Qin released another ripple across the vast tapestry of the warring states. Yet beneath that exhale lay something deeper, a subtle tension that threaded through river valleys, distant markets, and the great mountain passes of the east. The kingdoms that remained understood what these victories meant. One by one, the old pillars of the world were being gently, steadily reshaped. And though no trumpet announced this truth, it echoed softly in the thoughts of rulers and common people alike. Of the kingdoms still standing, the state of Yang felt both distant and vulnerable. Yang lay far to the northeast, its borders stretching toward colder climates and winds that carried the scent of pine and snow. For generations, Yang had maintained a quieter presence compared to the fierce reputation of states like Zhao or the vast expanse of Chu. It had endured hardships from nomadic threats and internal instability, but it had also cultivated a resilience that lived in the hearts of its people. I picture the Yang capital of Ji in these early days after Wei's collapse. The air is cold, brushing gently against the roofs of wooden houses and watchtowers. Merchants pour hot water into small clay kettles as they open their stalls. Farmers wrap layers of cloth around their shoulders before walking out to their fields. Scholars shuffle along narrow streets toward academies where quiet discussions await. Life in Yang carries a softness shaped by its climate, something steady, deliberate, and cautious. but beneath that calm surface, fear settles like frost. Yang's leaders watch Qin's progress with growing dread. They have seen the precision of Yingzheng's generals, the discipline of the Qin armies, and the inevitability that marks each campaign. They know that when Qin fixes its attention on a kingdom, that kingdom's days are numbered unless drastic action is taken. And so, the court of Yang begins to debate not how to resist Qin, but how to survive. It is in this delicate climate that one of the most dramatic and haunting stories of the Warring States era takes shape. A story not of armies or sieges, but of a single man entrusted with a desperate mission. His name was Jing Ke, and his role in history would emerge from the quiet desperation of a kingdom facing its end. In the palace halls of Yang, the king and his advisors gather under the glow of tall, flickering candles. Their robes whisper softly as they pace. Their conversations are tense, but muted, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile composure holding the room together. Among them stands Crown Prince Dan, a figure shaped by both grief and fear. Years earlier, he had lived in Qin as a political hostage, just as Yingling had once lived in Zhao. While Yingling returned to his homeland and rose to power, Prince Dan felt overlooked and belittled during his time in Qin. He returned to Yang bearing a quiet resentment that now deepened into urgency. Prince Dan believed that Qin's unification efforts would soon turn fully toward his homeland. And so he proposed a plan both daring and grim, an assassination attempt on King Zheng of Qin. Not out of ambition, but out of desperation. He saw no other path to protect his people. His mind, filled with the memories of Qin's cold corridors and the indifference he felt there, now fixated on the belief that only a single, decisive act could alter the course of fate. In choosing Jing Ke for this mission, the prince selected a man known for his calm demeanor, his steady resolve, and his understanding of danger. Jing Ke was not a soldier driven by fury or honor. He was pragmatic, quiet, thoughtful. I imagine him seated outside the city walls on the evening before his journey, sharpening a small dagger as the wind brushes through nearby reeds. The sky has turned a pale shade of violet. The river glimmers softly beneath the fading light. He moves slowly, carefully, as though the weight of the task rests not only on his hands but on the very air around him. Yang's leaders understood the magnitude of what they were preparing. Survival required a sacrifice. And the dagger Jing Ke carried was sheathed not only in metal, but in the anxieties of an entire kingdom. To gain an audience with Yingzheng, Jing Ke would present the severed head of a traitor from Yang who had defected to Qin. An offering meant to demonstrate loyalty to Qin while masking the true purpose of his arrival. Along with this, he would carry a map of a disputed territory rolled tightly around the hidden dagger. The night before Jing Ke's departure, a small gathering took place along the banks of the Yi River. It was a quiet, mournful farewell. Musicians played a haunting melody. Wine was poured. Voices drifted into the cool night air. Prince Dan wept openly as he held Jing Ke's arm, knowing the man would not return. The river carried their sorrow eastward in gentle ripples. I imagine the reed swaying softly as Jing Ke stepped into his boat, the lantern light behind him trembling with the breeze. The musician's song followed him across the water, their notes thin and aching. Perhaps he felt a moment of stillness there, suspended between duty and the unknowable path ahead. The mission was nearly impossible. Yet he accepted it with solemn grace, carrying with him the weight of a kingdom and the quiet plea of a young prince who feared for his people. While Jing Ke's journey began, the Qin capital continued its steady rhythm. Yingling, unaware of the approaching danger, focused deeply on governance and preparation. His ministers brought updates from Wei. Generals reported newly secured regions. Maps of the eastern states lay unfurled in his chambers, marked with careful notations. The king's mind was fixed not on survival, but on the horizon of unification. The contrast between Qin and Yang in this moment feels profound. Qin moved like a river carving through stone, slow, powerful, inevitable. Yang moved like a flickering flame in wind, shaken, vulnerable, desperate to hold its shape. And between them, Jing Ke traveled with the calm of a man who understood that history sometimes rests on the edge of a single, quiet decision. The winter wind carried him toward a fate written in the dim corridors of Qin's palace, a fate that would leave its mark not through victory, but through the enduring weight of a moment when one kingdom dared to grasp at hope with trembling hands. And so, across roads lined with frost, over rivers hardened by cold, a lone figure moved steadily toward the palace of the most powerful king in the land, carrying with him both a dagger and the final fragile hope of a distant kingdom. Part 10. As I settle into the quiet stillness of this next chapter, I feel the weight of a single moment drawing nearer, like a lantern slowly brightening at the end of a long corridor. Across the cold winter roads of the north, Jing Ke continued his solemn journey toward Qin, unaware that history would hold his name with a strange mixture of grief, admiration, and sorrow. The land around him, shaped by frost and pale light, seemed to listen to his footsteps with quiet sympathy. Every breath of wind through the reeds, every distant bark of a roaming dog, every flutter of birds lifting from bare branches echoed the fragile hope of a kingdom trying desperately to survive. When I imagine Jing Ke approaching the Qin capital, I see a landscape gradually shifting from rural stillness to the steady pulse of an empire in motion. Roads widen. Traffic increases. Farmers lead carts piled with winter greens. Soldiers march in disciplined formations. Artisans stir vats of steaming dye. Blacksmiths hammer softly, sparks rising and fading like fireflies. Through all of this activity, Jing Ke walks with composed steps, carrying the carefully arranged gifts that would grant him access to the king, an act of homage masking a mission of death. The Qin capital of Xianyang rises before him with imposing grandeur. Its walls, tall and commanding, reflect the ambition of the kingdom that built them. Watchtowers stand like patient sentinels. Gateways arch overhead, adorned with carvings that speak of order, strength, and unshaken purpose. Inside, the city spreads across the land in meticulous grids. Palaces, government halls, armories, and markets interlock like pieces of a plan formed long before Jing Ke's arrival. I picture him pausing at the entrance in the muted morning light, surrounded by guards who study him with cautious eyes. His expression remains calm. He carries nothing of the frantic or desperate in his demeanor. And perhaps that composure is what enables him to pass through the great gates, leading him into the very heart of the kingdom he has been sent to challenge. Inside the palace complex, the air feels cooler, touched by the faint scent of incense and polished stone. Servants move quietly along the long corridors. Scribes carry scrolls toward council halls. Ministers walk in pairs, murmuring softly about matters of state. Everywhere the sense of order is absolute. Everything has purpose. Everything moves with deliberate grace. When Jing Ke is brought before the court to present the offerings from Yang, the tension of the moment is not visible, but it hums beneath the surface like a tremor beneath the earth. Dignitaries from various regions stand in attendance, their robes falling in elegant waves around them. Qin guards, disciplined and unwavering, hold their halberds at precise angles. Lanterns flicker with warm light, casting gentle shadows across the floor of polished stone. Then, at last, the king enters. Daliang carries himself with quiet authority, shaped by victories, hardships, and an unwavering belief in his destiny. His gaze is steadied by years of disciplined focus. His posture is straight, fluid, almost serene. As he steps toward the throne, the court falls into a soft hush. Even the air seems to hold itself still. Jing Ke bows deeply, offering the severed head of the traitor who defected from Yang. The court murmurs with quiet approval, the gesture seen as a sign of submission. After a pause, Jing Ke presents the map of the disputed territories, a map rolled tightly around a hidden dagger. It is this moment, this seemingly simple presentation, that stretches time into a thin, trembling thread. The king steps forward to examine the map. I imagine the slow motion of Jing Ke's hand as he unrolls it, layer by layer, revealing territory and mountain passes drawn in careful strokes. And at the final turn, there, in an instant marked by a quiet intake of breath, the dagger emerges from its hidden place. The room erupts not with noise, but with a wave of startled tension. Jing Ke lunges forward, aiming for the king's chest. His movement is swift, driven by the desperation of a dying kingdom. But Handan reacts with remarkable agility, stepping back with a fluid grace born of both instinct and training. His robes flutter softly. His expression sharpens but does not crumble. Guards rush toward the assassin, but Qin's strict palace protocols prevent them from carrying weapons inside the chamber. For a moment, the room is filled with a haunting silence broken only by the sound of hurried footsteps on stone. Jing Ke pursues the king around a tall pillar, dagger glinting under lantern light. It is a strange, almost surreal scene, the most powerful man in the land stepping lightly around columns while an assassin tries to complete a mission he knows he will not survive. At last, guards manage to break protocol, bringing weapons forward. Jing Ke is struck down, collapsing onto the cold stone floor. His breath slows. His body stills. And within that stillness rests all the sorrow, hope, and desperation of the kingdom he served. I imagine the court standing frozen in place, the weight of the moment settling upon them like a heavy cloth. The king regains his composure quickly, his voice measured, steady, instructing the guards to restore order. The dagger is removed. The floor is cleaned. Ministers whisper among themselves, trying to understand the depth of meaning behind Yang's drastic act. In that private moment after the court disperses, I picture Handan alone in his chambers, sitting in calm reflection as the lantern light flickers across the map laid before him. He sees more than an assassination attempt. He sees fear. He sees inevitability. He sees the way other kingdoms perceive Qin's advance. And he understands, perhaps more deeply than before, that unification will require not only strength, but relentless resolve. Rumors of the failed assassination spread quickly across the land. In Yang, sorrow blankets the kingdom like winter frost. Prince Dao's desperation is exposed. The people grieve for Jing Ke, remembering him as a man who walked toward death with calm dignity. In distant regions, other rulers grow fearful, understanding that Qin's ascent cannot be halted by blades hidden in scrolls. And through all of this, the land remains quiet. The rivers flow with their usual rhythm. Frost gathers on branches. Lanterns glow softly in distant villages. The world, shaped by a single, failed act, continues to move with gentle, unbroken breaths. In that fragile quiet, the fate of Yang trembles like a lone reed in winter wind, knowing well that the moment of reckoning has begun. Part 11. In the quiet aftermath of Jing Ke's failed attempt, a subtle but unmistakable shift spread across the land, like ripples moving outward from a stone dropped into a still pond. It was not the loud, immediate shock that sometimes follows dramatic events, but something gentler and deeper, settling slowly into valleys, market squares, and the dim corridors of royal palaces. Rumors traveled softly from village to village, carried by travelers who paused for tea, merchants returning from long routes, and soldiers sharing quiet conversations beside campfires. Everywhere the same truth lingered. Yang had grasped at a fragile hope, and that hope had slipped through its fingers. In the Qin capital, the court maintained its deliberate composure. Rituals were upheld. Council meetings proceeded with calm precision. Scribes continued their work, recording decisions in neat, steady lines. But beneath the surface, a different energy stirred. There was a sense of something tightening around the remaining states, a kind of inevitability that no kingdom could comfortably ignore. Ding Deng himself moved through these days with clear intent, knowing that the failed assassination had removed all possible illusion about Yang's place in the world. The king's resolve, already strong, settled into something quieter, firmer, and more unshakable. I imagine him walking through the palace gardens on a cool morning, accompanied only by the soft rustle of leaves and the faint trickle of water from a stone fountain. He moves with calm strides, though his thoughts carry a weight shaped by both necessity and destiny. Jing Ke's dagger had not altered his path. Instead, it had sharpened it. The kingdom of Yang had revealed through its desperation that it no longer possessed the strength to stand on its own. Far to the northeast, the people of Yang awakened each day with a heavy stillness settling over their hearts. The capital, Ji, felt quieter than usual. Market streets that once bustled with brisk morning exchanges now held long shadows and subdued voices. Citizens gathered near shop fronts or stood beside wells, discussing the rumors that drifted in from neighboring lands. They spoke of Jing Ke with reverence, of the courage he carried into the heart of Qin, and of the sorrow that followed each retelling of his story. But even admiration could not mask the truth. Yang was vulnerable. Its armies were smaller than those of its rivals. Its leaders were fractured by fear. And its people, though resilient, sensed the approach of a force that had already reshaped the fates of Zhao and Wei. That fear hung in the air like frost lingering long after sunrise. Prince Dan, who had orchestrated the assassination attempt, now found himself bearing the full burden of its failure. In the palace chambers, heavy with incense, he paced with increasing agitation. His plan had been bold, but the consequences had fallen heavily upon his kingdom. He knew Qin would not forget such an insult. He knew the retaliation would come. And so he walked through long hallways lit by dim oil lamps, hearing each soft footstep echo his growing despair. King Shi of Yang, older and more weary than he once had been, stood at the center of this storm. Ministers gathered before him, their faces drawn with worry, their voices trembling with urgency. Some urged retreat to the distant northern territories. Others argued for one final alliance with remaining states. A few, whispering through tears, suggested preparing the people for the inevitable. The chamber felt thick with emotion, like a room filled with smoke where each breath became more difficult. I picture the king stepping away from the council, standing beside a window that overlooks the ancient city walls. The cold wind slips through the cracks, brushing against his robes. Below, the city he has ruled for decades sprawls in muted tones. He knows it intimately, the rhythms of its markets, the call of its watchtower drums, the scent of its winter fires. And now, he senses all of it trembling beneath the shadow of Qin's advance. Meanwhile, in the Qin encampments far to the west, preparations began with quiet precision. Generals consulted with careful voices, tracing routes that would take their armies toward Yang. Supplies were gathered, horses groomed, armor polished. But the tone was not triumphant. It was steady, measured, almost solemn. Qin soldiers understood the significance of their mission. With each campaign, the land drew closer to unity, and with unity came burden as well as power. Among these commanders was Wang Jian, whose wisdom and caution had guided Qin through earlier victories. Wang Jian did not rush. He spoke of timing, logistics, and the importance of maintaining discipline. I imagine him seated in a large tent lit by the warm glow of 2 lanterns, listening closely to the reports brought by scouts, his expression calm but attentive. The fall of Yang would not be a sudden strike. It would be a slow, steady tightening of lines, the same pattern that had guided Qin's earlier successes. The armies marched northward as winter deepened. Through valleys lined with brittle grasses, over frozen rivers that bore the marks of past migrations, and along mountain passes where cold winds whistled softly, the troops advanced. Their footsteps formed a rhythm that carried through quiet forests and across quiet plains. Villagers watching from afar saw them as an endless line of patient, determined figures moving steadily toward a single purpose. As Qin approached Yang's borders, the kingdom's leadership reached a painful decision. Prince Dan, whose actions had provoked the crisis, could no longer remain within the capital. To appease Qin, to buy even a sliver of time, the king sent his son away under guard, an act both desperate and heartbreaking. I imagine the prince's departure at dawn, the sky washed in pale grey. His breath forms small clouds in the cold air. His eyes linger on the city walls he may never see again. And beside him, a handful of loyal attendants walk in silence, understanding the quiet tragedy of the moment. The people of the capital watched his departure with heavy hearts. Some whispered prayers. Others bowed their heads. A few raised their hands in farewell, though they knew the gesture might never reach him. It was a moment of profound sorrow, one that revealed the depth of Yang's desperation and the fragility of its remaining hope. With the prince gone and Qin's forces drawing nearer, the land of Yang settled into a somber acceptance. Traders along the roads traveled more quietly. Farmers harvested what they could before the final frost. Families gathered by their hearths, speaking in hushed tones as they wrapped their children in warm blankets. The world around them remained beautiful in its winter stillness, yet beneath that beauty lay the unmistakable sense that an old era was slipping gently into its final days. And in that quiet, under cold skies and dim winter light, the kingdom of Yang waited, its strength nearly spent, its hope carried only by the faint, trembling pulse of resignation. Part 12. 1000 Words. In the stillness of this next chapter, the world of Yang seems wrapped in a kind of subdued twilight, as though the land itself has drawn a soft, pale veil over its fields and forests. Winter lingers longer here in the northeast. Snow settles in thin layers across the rooftops. Ice forms delicate lattices along the edges of river banks. And the people of Yang feel this cold not only in the air, but in their hearts, aware that the long shadow of Qin stretches closer with every passing day. The quiet resignation that settled over the kingdom did not arrive suddenly. It crept in gradually, like frost threading its way through dry grass. Traders who once traveled west now returned with low voices and worried expressions. Villagers gathered around evening fires, listening to stories of Qin's steady advance, their breaths forming pale clouds in the dim light. Even the animals seemed to sense a shift in the world. Horses stamped more restlessly in their stalls. Dogs barked at distant, unseen movements in the night. The land felt tense, as though waiting for something it already understood. In the Yang capital, Ji, ministers continued to convene in cold council chambers, their robes brushing softly across the stone floors. Each meeting carried the same burdensome weight. Information arrived in the form of dwindling options, never solutions. Scouts sent from the borders returned with troubling reports. Fortified towns falling one by one, Qin detachments moving with the same controlled discipline that had defined their earlier campaigns, villages submitting without resistance. The ministers spoke in low tones, trying to find cracks, delays, strategies. Yet every idea dissipated like warm breath fading into winter air. Qin Shi sat through these meetings with a quiet heaviness in his posture. His face, once firm and resolute, now carried lines etched deeply by worry. Though he maintained an outward calm, an unmistakable sorrow lingered in his eyes. He had ruled long enough to know when the tide of history moved against him. Still, he remained determined to slow that tide, even if only for the sake of his people. The absence of Prince Dan weighed silently on the court. His exile, meant as a gesture to ease Qin's anger, had not brought the hoped-for relief. Instead, it carved a painful hollow into the hearts of those who once looked to him as the kingdom's future. In the quiet corners of the palace, servants whispered prayers for his safety, though they knew he walked a path without return. The king, in rare private moments, allowed himself to remember his son as a boy chasing sparrows across palace courtyards, laughing with a freedom that now felt impossibly distant. Meanwhile, Qin's forces continued their advance. The seasoned General Wang Jian, along with other commanders, orchestrated the campaign with calm precision. Unlike the battles fought in the plains of Zhao or the waterways of Wei, the march toward Yang carried a quieter tone, shaped by the cold winds and remote landscapes of the northeast. Soldiers moved across frozen ground, their breath rising in steady rhythms. Tents stood arranged in neat patterns, glowing softly from within as lanterns cast warm circles of light against the snow. I imagine the Qin troops moving before dawn, their boots crunching gently on icy earth. Horses snort into the cold air, forming clouds that drift and fade. The sound of distant birds echoes faintly across the land, their calls reminding the soldiers of warmer days long behind them. Yet the army maintains its discipline. Every step is coordinated. Every movement intentional. The momentum behind them feels nearly inevitable. When Qin reached the borders of Yang, smaller towns yielded without significant resistance, their walls worn, their garrisons wary. Some citizens, tired from years of uncertainty, greeted the Qin soldiers with quiet acceptance. They understood that resistance would bring devastation. The guards who once manned the watchtowers lowered their weapons with solemn nods. A few elders stepped forward to offer bowls of warm broth, a gesture of weary hospitality in a land where survival had become a delicate balance. But not every part of Yang went quietly. In certain regions, clusters of soldiers and villagers attempted to mount a defense. These efforts were marked by courage but not coordination. Qin's forces, trained and unified, overcame them with the same calm efficiency seen throughout the warring states' campaigns. The skirmishes that unfolded were brief. Snow muffled the sounds of clashing metal. Afterward, the land returned quickly to silence, as though it wished to forget the violence almost as soon as it occurred. Within the capital, Qin Shi realized the moment he had long hoped to delay had finally arrived. Qin troops were approaching Ji. Defensive lines could not hold. Supplies had dwindled. And morale, fragile as thin ice, had begun to crack beneath the strain. Ministers urged retreat to distant fortresses, but the king knew those fortresses would eventually fall as well. Others urged negotiations, but the failed assassination attempt and Yang's weakened position left little room for leniency. And so, in one of the most somber mornings of the kingdom's history, King Shi gathered his council and announced that Yang would move its court northward to the distant region of Liaodong. The relocation offered a small hope of continued governance. But it also meant abandoning Ji, abandoning the heart of Yang's culture, history, and identity. I imagine the preparations unfolding slowly, painfully. Palace servants packing scrolls and ceremonial objects with trembling hands. Guards escorting members of the royal family through quiet halls where echoes lingered uncomfortably long. The king walking one final time through the ancestral shrine, bowing before the tablets of past rulers, whispering apologies that only the cold stone could hear. When the royal procession finally left Ji, the streets were lined with citizens standing in heavy silence. Some bowed. Others held their children close. A few reached out hands that stopped short of touching the passing officials. A gentle snow fell over the city, muffling each step of the departing court. And above them, the sky seemed to hold its breath. Not long after, Qin forces entered Ji with the same disciplined calm seen in every conquest. There was no great fanfare, no chaotic rush. Soldiers moved through the city with measured steps, securing key locations, ensuring stability, and marking the inevitability of the kingdom's changing fate. The people watched quietly, some with fear, others with acceptance, others simply with exhaustion. Yang had not surrendered entirely, not yet. But its heartland now lay firmly under Qin's control. A centuries-old kingdom had shifted from standing independent to standing on the edge of history's turning tide. And as winter deepened across the lands of the northeast, the soft hush of snow settled gently over the rooftops of Ji, as though the world itself were offering a quiet farewell to the kingdom that had once thrived beneath its pale, distant skies. Part 13. As the cold grip of winter continued to hold the northeast, the kingdom of Yang drifted into a strange and sorrowful quiet. Its royal court, now relocated far from the capital, carried the heavy knowledge that the heart of their homeland had already slipped from their grasp. Ji, once vibrant with culture and bustling avenues, now lay under the calm, steady control of Qin. And while small remnants of Yang authority remained in the distant region of Liaodong, the kingdom's pulse had weakened to a faint, trembling beat. I picture that northern refuge, isolated and windswept, where the surviving ministers gathered in makeshift halls. Their robes no longer carried the elegance of earlier days. Their voices rose not with confidence but with weary resignation. Snow accumulated outside in soft drifts, pressing against wooden walls. Oil lamps flickered uncertainly in the chilly air. Everything about the scene felt temporary, like a faint echo of a world already fading into the past. King Shi sat at the center of these meetings, his face pale in the dim light. Though he tried to maintain a composed posture, the sorrow in his eyes betrayed him. He listened as ministers proposed plans to rebuild armies, to rally loyal citizens, to attempt alliances with distant states. Yet each idea felt thin, insubstantial, unable to stand against the reality that Qin's forces had already severed the threads connecting Yang's core to its outer reaches. The failed assassination, the weakened borders, the broken faith within the kingdom, these truths lay over every conversation like a heavy cloth. Meanwhile, Qin did not rush to eliminate the remaining territories of Yang. Its armies paused, consolidating control over the lands they had taken. Winter made large-scale movement difficult. Roads iced over. Mountain passes became treacherous. And Qin, ever methodical, allowed the season to guide its timing. But beneath that outward stillness, preparations continued quietly. Soldiers drilled even in snow-covered fields. Generals studied maps. Supply caravans moved steadily from the heartland to the frontier, ensuring that when spring returned, Qin's momentum would resume without hesitation. For a time, this lull allowed the land itself to settle. I imagine the countryside stretching beneath a pale sky, its fields buried under layers of frost. Small villages nestled against hillsides, their chimneys sending thin trails of smoke into the cold air. Families gathered close around hearths, sharing warm meals and whispered conversations. Some spoke anxiously of Qin's advance. Others simply held each other, knowing that change had become inevitable. Within Liaodong, the displaced Yang court attempted to resume governance, though the effort felt strained. Officials slept little. Messengers arrived with troubling news about Qin fortifying its presence in Ji. And somewhere in this fragile environment, Prince Dan, whose desperate act had ignited the final collapse, remained hidden, his presence more a burden than a source of hope. The king knew this, deep in his heart. He understood that Qin's demand for accountability would not fade with time. Jing Ke's failed attempt still hung between the two kingdoms like a wound that refused to close. And so, in a moment of anguished clarity, King Shi faced a decision that revealed the cruel cost of political desperation. He ordered the death of his own son. It was not a decision taken lightly. Ministers spoke against it. Loyal attendants wept. But the king, overcome with grief and fear, believed that offering Prince Dan's life might placate Qin. Might buy even the smallest opportunity for the remaining people of Yang to survive. I imagine him delivering the order with a trembling voice, his breath unsteady, his hands clutching the arms of his chair as though holding himself in place against a storm. Prince Dan, when confronted with the decree, reportedly accepted his fate with tragic calm. Perhaps he understood the consequences of his earlier choices. Perhaps he saw that the weight of his actions had fallen too heavily upon a kingdom already struggling to endure. I picture him standing atop a snow-covered hill, the wind sweeping across the landscape, carrying with it a faint echo of the homeland he would never truly return to. His life ended quietly, swallowed by the winter air and the sorrow of a kingdom collapsing under the weight of history. When word of this sacrifice reached Yingmeng, the king of Qin received it not with satisfaction, but with measured acknowledgement. Yang's attempt to atone could not undo the past, but it revealed something Qin valued, a kingdom finally recognizing the reality of its position. Yet even this tragic offering could not halt the march of unification. It could only soften the transition, making the final absorption of Yang less violent than it might otherwise have been. As winter gradually gave way to early spring, the lands of the northeast began to thaw. Rivers cracked open. Patches of green emerged beneath melting snow. Birds returned to bare branches, filling the air with tentative chirps. Against this gentle awakening of the natural world, Qin moved once more. Armies traveled along newly passable roads. Their banners fluttered in cool breezes. Their disciplined footsteps echoed across valleys and rolling terrain. The people of the remaining Yang territories, already exhausted by fear and uncertainty, found themselves unable to muster significant resistance. Small garrisons surrendered with quiet resignation. Local leaders negotiated terms to protect their families and villages. And as Qin's influence spread, the administrative systems it brought began to take root. Measured laws, standardized weights, efficient taxation. The familiar structures of governance that had defined Qin's earlier conquests now extended into the final reaches of Yang. The fall of Yang was not marked by a single dramatic battle or moment of spectacle. Instead, it unfolded like the final dimming of a lantern that had long been flickering. A kingdom shaped by centuries of culture, hardship, resilience, and shifting fortunes gradually folded into the expanding realm of Qin. What remained was memory. The songs sung along its riverbanks, the stories told beneath its winter skies, the quiet pride of a people who had endured so much. As Qin established full control, the landscape of the northeast took on a new sense of stillness. Ji continued its daily rhythms under new order. Markets reopened with cautious optimism. Fields prepared for spring planting. Children played in narrow streets, their laughter rising above the soft hum of life returning. The past lingered in the corners, yes, but life moved forward, as it always does. And far to the north, the icy winds continued their quiet sweep across the hills of Liaodong, carrying with them the final, fading whisper of a kingdom that had given everything it could, yet could not escape the turning of the age. Part 14. With Yang now folded quietly into Qin's widening realm, the land seemed to enter a brief, contemplative stillness. The snow melted across the northeast, revealing softened earth and pale stretches of new growth. Rivers ran fuller, carrying the murmur of spring through villages and fields that had long endured under winter's weight. And as the sunlight lengthened its reach across the plains, the people of the former Yang territories adjusted, slowly, cautiously, to the rhythm of Qin governance. Their days became shaped by new laws, new officials, new expectations. Life continued, though the memory of their kingdom lingered like the scent of smoke long after a fire has dimmed. Yet beyond this quiet surface, the great arc of history was already bending toward the next kingdom in Qin's path. South of Yang lay the state of Chu, vast and ancient. Chu was unlike the northern kingdoms Qin had faced. It stretched across fertile river valleys, thick forests, and humid lowlands. Its culture differed from the central plains. Its music held deeper tones. Its language carried softer, rounded sounds. Its rituals traced older lines, imbued with a mystique that made Chu feel almost like a world unto itself. For centuries, Chu had been a dominant force, a kingdom of grand courts, legendary poets, and powerful armies. Even weakened by earlier conflicts, it remained formidable. I imagine the land of Chu in these days, washed in the gentler light of the south. Plum blossoms unfurling along river banks. Mist rising from broad wetlands. Fishermen casting nets into shimmering water at dawn. The hum of insects thickening in the warm air as spring settled more fully across the region. Beneath this serene beauty, however, lay a quiet tension. Chu understood that Qin's gaze had shifted. And when Qin looked toward a kingdom, that kingdom felt its pulse quicken. In the Chu capital of Shouchuan, court officials gathered in grand halls scented with incense and adorned with carvings of dragons and flowing clouds. Their robes of deep green and violet rustled softly as they paced the polished floors. They spoke in urgent tones, though always with the elegance characteristic of Chu's refined traditions. They discussed the fall of Yang, the strategies of Qin's generals, and the unpredictable movements that marked Yingveng's pursuit of unification. King Huai of Chu, weary from the burdens of leadership, listened to his ministers with a mixture of concern and pride. Chu had survived countless hardships in the past. Its people were resilient. Its armies, though strained, still held strong positions across key regions. And the kingdom's sheer size made it more challenging than Yang or Wei. Yet the king could not ignore what every minister felt but struggled to say aloud. Qin's steady pattern of conquest left little room for optimism. Meanwhile, Lingding prepared his next campaign with the same quiet, focused determination that had guided him through earlier victories. The king understood that Chu would be his greatest challenge yet. It required not only military strategy, but patience, adaptability, and a deep respect for the terrain itself. He turned once again to his most trusted generals, men like Wang Jian, who had proven their wisdom and restraint in difficult campaigns. I imagine Qin's war councils during this time. Large maps spread across low tables. Markers indicating troops and supply routes. Lantern light flickering over the attentive faces of generals. The air thick with the scent of ink and old leather. Ying Zheng sits quietly, listening as each commander outlines possible routes into Chu. The wetlands, the rivers, the thick forests, all these features meant the campaign would differ from the northern conquests. But his goals remained clear. To unify the land, Qin would need to understand Chu. Not only its weaknesses, but its deep-rooted strengths. While planning commenced in Zhanyang, life in Chu flowed with its usual soulful rhythm. Musicians played zithers beneath shade trees. Poets recited verses near temple courtyards. Farmers prepared their fields along the Yangtze tributaries, the air buzzing with the sound of insects returning with warm weather. Children chased each other between wide timber homes. The world here felt older, softer. Yet beneath these peaceful scenes, unease whispered through the land, as persistent as the hum of the forest. Chu's generals urged caution, knowing that Qin's disciplined armies would not advance carelessly. They argued for strengthening fortifications, repositioning troops, and reinforcing alliances with remaining independent states, especially Qi in the Far East. But Qi, cautious and slow to commit, offered little reassurance. The alliances that had once bound the kingdoms together were fraying. Fear pulled each one into its own orbit, leaving Chu more isolated than it wished to be. Amid all this uncertainty, one of Chu's greatest commanders, Xiangyang, stepped forward as a symbol of resistance. His presence carried confidence shaped by years of battlefield experience. Soldiers respected him. Civilians admired him. Even in the dim light of council chambers, his voice held a steadiness that quieted the room. He knew the dangers ahead. He understood the discipline and cunning of Qin's forces. But he also believed that Chu's spirit, shaped by centuries of resilience, could endure. In the months that followed, Qin began its southward preparations. Troops moved across mountain passes. Supply lines were reinforced. Ships were ready to navigate rivers that wound like silver threads through forest and marsh. And in each garrison, soldiers rehearsed formations, their movements echoing the same calm precision that had shaped Qin's earlier triumphs. Spring ripened into early summer. Warm winds swept across the land, carrying the scent of river water and blooming flowers. And then, one morning, the first quiet indicators of Qin's movement reached the ears of Chu's border scouts. Dust rising along distant roads. The faint shimmer of armor. The silhouette of banners shifting like pale leaves against the horizon. Word traveled quickly to Shochuan. Ministers gathered once more. Generals positioned themselves along maps. And the king, exhausted but resolute, prepared for a confrontation he had hoped would remain further in the future. I imagine the people of Chu in those days before Qin's full advance, families stepping outside their homes at dusk, staring toward the western sky with anxious uncertainty. Some prayed at ancestral altars, lighting incense that curled upward into the warm air. Others continued their daily routines, choosing calm repetition over fear. But beneath their movements, a fragile tension draped itself across the land. Southward along the riverbanks, boats rocked gently in their moorings. Forests rustled with hidden life. And in the still hours before dawn, a subtle hush settled across Chu, as though the kingdom itself sensed the arrival of a great turning point. And so, with the warmth of early summer upon it, the vast and storied land of Chu found itself standing at the threshold of a confrontation that would test not only its armies, but its identity, its endurance, and the spirit that had shaped its people for generations. Part 15. As the warm breath of early summer deepened across the southern lands, the world of Chu seemed suspended between beauty and unease. The fragrance of blossoming trees drifted through the air. Riverbanks shimmered beneath soft sunlight. Farmers bent over lush fields, their hands brushing young rice shoots swaying like pale green silk. Yet beneath this outward gentleness, a quiet tremor worked its way into daily life. Each distant footfall, each approaching caravan, each messenger arriving with hurried breath carried the same unspoken truth: Qin was coming. It did not happen in a sudden wave. It began as a slow, steady movement, like the turning of a great wheel that had been gathering momentum for years. Scouts along Chu's northern and western borders noticed it first. Dust rising from distant roads. Columns of Qin soldiers moving in seamless formation. Supply wagons rolling with unwavering rhythm. Banners fluttering in the warm wind, marked with the unmistakable black emblem of Qin's discipline. These sightings spread from frontier posts to nearby villages, whispered among farmers, shared in hushed tones by travelers passing through market squares. The reports reached Shochuan soon enough. Inside the great halls where carved pillars rose toward high ceilings, Chu's ministers assembled in tense clusters. Their once confident debates had softened into strained exchanges. The loss of Yang to the north, the weakened state of Qi to the east, and the earlier collapse of Zhao all weighed heavily upon them. Yet Chu was unlike its neighbors. Its culture ran deep. Its territory stretched wide. Its people were known for resilience shaped by centuries of both prosperity and hardship. King Huai listened as his advisors spoke one after another. Some urged retreat to more defensible terrain. Some called for immediate battle, believing morale depended on a strong first strike. Others pleaded for diplomacy, though each of them knew Qin had little interest in negotiations at this stage. The king sat with stillness that masked the storm inside him. The weight of his ancestors, the fate of his people, the enormity of the moment, all of it pressed into his thoughts like the dense air before a summer storm. Amid these debates stood Xiangyang, the seasoned general whose presence radiated calm certainty. He had long been admired in Chu for his discipline, his understanding of the land, and his ability to lead with both strength and compassion. As he stepped forward, the room quieted. His eyes, deepened by years of command, drifted across the map spread before the ministers. Rivers, mountains, forests, marshlands, he knew each feature not just in theory but from experience. He spoke slowly, his voice steady as river stone. Chu must prepare for a prolonged campaign. Qin would not rush recklessly into unfamiliar southern terrain. The wetlands, heavy with humidity, would slow their movement. The forests would narrow their formations. The rivers would complicate their supply lines. Xiangyang understood what many feared to acknowledge, that Chu could not rely on speed or overwhelming force. It must rely on patience, strategy, and its intimate knowledge of the land itself. I imagine him standing at the edge of the map, one hand resting lightly on its surface. The lantern light plays across his features. Ministers watch him with a mixture of respect and quiet desperation. Even the king leans forward slightly, absorbing each word. Xiangyang does not promise victory. He promises resistance. And in that moment, the air in the chamber feels a little less suffocating. Meanwhile, far to the north and west, Qin's advance continued at a calm, deliberate pace. Soldiers crossed mountain passes softened by early summer growth. They marched through valleys lush with new vegetation. Camps sprung up beside rivers, their reflections shimmering in the water like clusters of disciplined shadows. Generals like Wang Jian and Wang Ben oversaw movements with characteristic restraint. They understood the danger of underestimating Chu. Unlike earlier campaigns in the flat northern plains, this war required adaptability. I imagine Qin soldiers moving at dawn, their armor glinting gold in the rising light. The air carries a humid heaviness unfamiliar to many of them. Cicadas drone from the trees. The scent of wet earth clings to their boots. Yet their steps remain unbroken, their lines unshifting. They adjust to the southern climate with quiet resolve. In the villages along Chu's frontier, news of Qin's approach unsettled the steady rhythm of life. Mothers kept their children closer. Elders gathered in shaded courtyards to discuss stories from their youth, when Chu had stood strong against earlier threats. Farmers worked with heavier hearts, planting new seedlings while listening for news carried by the wind. Every distant drumbeat, real or imagined, brought a ripple of unease through the fields. Yet even amid this rising tension, the land of Chu retained its serene beauty. Rivers moved gently beneath overhanging branches. Boats glided across their surfaces, fishermen guiding them with slow, practiced motions. In certain towns, musicians still played evening melodies, their instruments releasing soft, lingering notes that drifted through warm air. Life persisted with elegance, as though trying to hold on to the world it had known for generations. As Qin drew closer, King Huai ordered families living near the border to relocate deeper into Chu territory. Caravans of ox-pulled carts rolled along dusty roads. Children clung to bundles of belongings. Women led goats and chickens along behind them. The distant horizon shimmered with heat, turning the silhouettes of trees into wavering shapes. Every step away from their homes carried a quiet ache. Within Shouchuan, preparations intensified. Blacksmiths hammered through the night, sparks dancing in the shadows. Soldiers sharpened spears, fitted new bows, and repaired armor. Horses were brushed, fed, and trained for the humid conditions they would face. Xiangyang oversaw these preparations with tireless focus. He walked through training yards where the sounds of drilling soldiers formed steady, rhythmic patterns. He spoke with commanders individually, ensuring each man understood his role in the vast, unfolding plan. Despite his composure, I imagine moments when Xiangyang paused alone, perhaps beneath a willow tree near a quiet stream, allowing himself a rare breath of stillness. The scent of watergrass and warm leaves drifted around him. The wind rustled softly. And in that fragile silence, he might have sensed the shape of the struggle ahead, a long, difficult confrontation that would test the limits of both strength and endurance. Back in the capital, the king moved through his private chambers with a heaviness that never quite lifted. He ate little, slept rarely, and though he stood tall before his court, the quiet moments found him staring out over the gardens, watching lotus leaves tremble in the warm breeze. He knew his kingdom's fate rested not only on military leaders, but on the spirit of his people and the uncertain will of the world beyond. And as summer's warmth deepened, spreading across the wetlands, forests, and rivers of Chu, the land itself seemed to brace, not with panic, but with a solemn, dignified patience. The leaves rustled softly. Water glimmered beneath shifting sunlight. Clouds drifted lazily overhead. Nature continued its calm routines, even as human hearts tightened in anticipation. In that gentle, humid stillness, with the chorus of insects rising into the evening air, the vast and storied kingdom of Chu stood quietly at the threshold of its greatest trial. Part 16. As summer settled fully across the southern lands, the kingdom of Chu took on a gentle, shimmering quality beneath the rising heat. The air thickened with the scent of river reeds and flowering trees. Warm breezes moved lazily through bamboo groves. Even the light itself seemed softer, diffused by moist air that rose from the vast wetlands stretching across the countryside. But beneath that tranquil veil, Chu braced itself, aware that each passing day carried Qin a little closer. In these weeks before the first major confrontations, life in Chu unfolded in a curious mixture of calm routine and quiet urgency. In villages near the border, families stored bundles of grain in earthen jars, preparing for unpredictable months ahead. Farmers paused mid-task to listen for distant sounds. A child, chasing fireflies beneath broadleaf trees, would sometimes stop and turn, sensing a tension that even innocence could not fully ignore. And in shaded market squares, elders recounted stories of Chu's ancient triumphs, trying to kindle courage in those who listened. Within the capital of Shochuan, the court functioned with strained elegance. Musicians still played ceremonious pieces during formal gatherings, but their notes felt more fragile, as though each sound risked shattering against the weight of the moment. Carved pillars and silk banners still adorned the grand halls, yet the people walking beneath them did so with tighter expressions, their movements carrying an unspoken heaviness. King Huai, exhausted by the strain of leadership, tried to maintain the dignity expected of him. He met daily with ministers in rooms washed with warm light filtering through latticed windows. Scrolls lay open before him, marked with troop numbers, supply inventories, and reports from the northern frontier. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but his eyes often drifted toward the maps, toward the borders where Qin's shadow lengthened. By his side, Xiangyang remained a steady pillar of resolve. The general moved through the palace with purposeful steps, offering his counsel with clarity and restraint. He understood Chu's vulnerabilities, yet he also understood its strengths. The kingdom's vast size worked in its favor. Its humid climate created difficulties for invading forces. And its people carried a deep cultural pride that could not be easily erased. Preparations for defense intensified. Along major riverways, boats were fitted with reinforced hulls. Soldiers constructed elevated platforms to oversee marshy terrain. Engineers inspected embankments and crosscurrents, identifying areas where the water itself could be turned into a strategic ally. Chu's generals reminded their troops to use the land, not fight against it. The dense forests, the deep wetlands, the twisting rivers, all could be guided into the rhythm of war. In contrast, Qin's advance across northern Chu territory occurred with measured discipline. The soldiers moved in long, living lines through mountain passes softened by early summer heat. Horses carried supplies through narrow trails bordered by thick vegetation. Scouts reported humidity so heavy it clung to armor like a damp cloak. In this unfamiliar climate, the usual crispness of Qin's formation softened around the edges, not from lack of discipline, but from the persistence of nature itself. Yet the generals pressed on. Wang Jian watched everything with the eyes of a man who had survived countless campaigns. He listened to the forests. He studied the wind. He observed how quickly rain could turn a road into mud. He marked each variable on his mental map, knowing the slightest oversight could unravel months of planning. Under his leadership, the soldiers learned to adapt. marching earlier in the morning, resting through the stifling heat at midday, moving again in the long, golden evening hours when the air felt mercifully lighter. While the armies maneuvered across the land, the people of Chu held tightly to moments of ordinary life. A potter kneaded clay beside a shimmering pond. A group of children gathered beneath a banyan tree to practice plucking at small bamboo flutes. Fishermen cast long, graceful arcs with their nets at dawn, the water reflecting the sky in gentle, shifting ripples. These scenes carried a quiet resilience, as though the land itself refused to surrender its beauty, even with war pressing upon it. As Qin drew closer, scattered skirmishes broke out across the northern reaches of Chu. These were not grand battles, no sweeping formations clashing across vast plains, but smaller confrontations shaped by Chu's landscape. Qin infantry found themselves navigating sudden pools of muddy water. Horses stumbled through thick tangles of undergrowth. Archers struggled with the weight of humidity, their bowstrings clinging with moisture. And all the while, Chu's defenders used the terrain to their advantage, striking swiftly before retreating into forests that swallowed footprints and muffled sound. But Qin's discipline remained firm. Each setback became a lesson. Each lesson became adjustment. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Qin's soldiers adapted to the challenges. Their formations tightened again. Their scouts learned to read the swampy ground. Their engineers crafted makeshift platforms to cross difficult marshes. And their progress, though slowed, resumed with quiet inevitability. I imagine the night before a significant engagement, when both armies rested beneath a canopy of warm darkness. On the Chu side, fires crackled near wetlands thick with reeds. Soldiers murmured to one another, voices low, the lantern light reflecting off damp leaves. Some men whispered prayers to ancestral spirits. Others sharpened blades beneath flickering light. The soft chorus of night insects wove itself around them, creating a strange sense of calm within the tension. In the Qin encampment, the air felt different, steady, focused, unwavering. Soldiers sat polishing armor, their movements slow and deliberate. Officers studied the stars to gauge the weather. Generals, cloaked in shadow, walked the perimeter of the camp, their footsteps nearly silent against the soft earth. Even the horses, sensing the gravity of the moment, pawed the ground with subdued energy. Across the landscape, the land itself seemed to hold its breath. The first truly consequential battle of the Qin-Chu campaign began not with a roar, but with the hush of early sunlight spreading across the plains. Mist clung to the lowlands. The air felt heavy, as though carrying the weight of the coming clash. Chu's soldiers took their positions along ridges overlooking marshy ground, their armor catching glints of soft light. Song Yang rode among them, offering quiet words of encouragement. Qin's army emerged from the haze in steady lines. The rhythm of their marching formed a soft thunder beneath the humid sky. Their banners fluttered like muted shadows. Their pace remained unbroken. When the two armies finally met, the sound rose slowly, shields striking, arrows loosed, spears clashing with measured force. The wetland swallowed some of the impact, dampening the noise, as though nature itself attempted to soften the violence. The battle lasted long into the day. Neither side broke easily. Chu fought with fierce, grounded knowledge of the land. Qin fought with disciplined resolve and unshakable purpose. And beneath the cacophony, the earth trembled with the weight of a conflict that would shape the balance of the world. As sunset cast golden light across the land, the fighting slowed. The air, thick with humidity and exhaustion, settled into an uneasy quiet. Both armies withdrew to regroup, neither claiming clear triumph, yet both understanding the gravity of what had begun. And in that warm, fading light, the kingdom of Chu stood poised between endurance and inevitability, wrapped in a silence that carried the echo of all that had been fought for, and all that still trembled in uncertainty. Part 17. In the days that followed that first great clash between Qin and Chu, the land seemed to breathe in long, uneven intervals, as though recovering from a deep strain. The wetlands, trampled by boots and churned by horses, slowly regained their stillness. Mist crept once more across shallow pools. Dragonflies hovered above reeds, swaying gently in the warm, southern air. And yet there lingered something beneath the quiet, something taut and subtle, like a string stretched just shy of snapping. Both kingdoms felt it. Both armies understood its meaning. The struggle had begun in earnest. In the Qin encampment, soldiers tended to their wounds with practiced calm. Physicians moved carefully between tents, applying poultices and stitching cuts with steady fingers. The low murmur of their instructions mingled with the rhythmic clinking of armor being repaired. Men sat polishing spearheads dulled by the moisture of the wetlands. Others rested with their backs against tree trunks, eyes half closed as they listened to the chorus of insects rising with the evening heat. The tired sighs and whispered conversations all floated into the air like smoke, forming a fragile veil of humanity over the hard edge of war. General Wang Jian walked among them, offering quiet nods, acknowledging each man with a presence that steadied the camp more effectively than any speech. His gaze sharpened as he studied the terrain. The way the land curved. The way the water pooled. The way the vegetation thickened near certain ridges. He saw, not just wetlands and forest, but a living map, a shifting page upon which the next movements must be written carefully. In contrast, the Chu encampment hummed with a different energy. Their soldiers, though weary, carried an undercurrent of fierce determination. For them, this land was home, each grove and marsh filled with memories. They spoke in voices tinged with pride, recounting how their ancestors had fought upon similar terrain, how Chu's spirit had endured through storms and invasions. Xiangyang moved through the camp like a grounding force. His presence soothed the anxious and emboldened the brave. Where others faltered, he remained composed, reading the land with the intuition of someone who had lived many lives along its rivers and forests. In those quiet nights, I picture Xiangyang standing alone near the water's edge, his silhouette outlined by moonlight shimmering across the surface. He listens, to frogs croaking, to reeds brushing against each other, to the distant rustle of leaves caught in warm breezes. He senses the weight of responsibility pressing upon him, not as a burden, but as a solemn promise he must honor. Behind him, the glow of campfires flickers softly across soldiers' faces. Ahead of him lies a world shadowed by Qin's advance. For several days after the initial confrontation, neither side rushed into full battle. Instead, the war unfolded through strategic adjustments. Qin moved pieces of its forces slowly southward, adjusting positions to account for the terrain's shifting character. Chu responded with its own subtle maneuvers, reinforcing key routes, setting hidden traps, and guiding their supplied transport along waterways less vulnerable to Qin scouts. These movements, though quiet, shaped the rhythm of the conflict. Each side probed, retreated, advanced, tested. Each small encounter carried the tension of greater things to come. I imagine these skirmishes beneath a canopy of humid leaves, soldiers stepping silently through thickets, arrows whispering through air thick with warmth, the faint splash of movement through narrow streams. Sometimes the forest itself swallowed confrontations whole, leaving only a few broken branches and disturbed water to whisper what had occurred. Yet Qin held one irreplaceable advantage: patience. Yingthang's vision was long, steady, unwavering. His generals mirrored this clarity. They did not feel pressure to strike decisively in every moment. They allowed the land to teach them, to slow them, to challenge them. And slowly, they found the rhythm of the south. Word of these developments traveled back to Shochuan each day. Messengers, clad in dusty robes and guided by urgency, crossed the kingdom's river valleys to deliver their scrolls to the palace. Ministers unrolled each report with solemn hands. Some clenched their jaws. Others whispered prayers. King Huai read each message quietly, eyes tracing every written line with increasing heaviness. Yet what struck him most was not Qin's advance, but the endurance of his own people, their refusal to allow fear to consume their spirit. Despite the rising tension, Chu's daily life continued in small, precious fragments. In rural towns, families gathered beneath broad wooden eaves, sharing bowls of rice and fish stew seasoned with familiar herbs. Children practiced calligraphy on smooth boards, though their strokes often wavered with uncertainty. In riverside markets, vendors displayed baskets of melons and fragrant leaves, hoping for even a modest day's trade. These small continuities formed a gentle shield against the immense uncertainty pressing in from beyond the horizon. But the pressure grew steadily. As Qin pushed deeper, supplies became harder to transport. Entire villages relocated further into the heartland. Refugees arrived at Shochuan, bringing stories of distant clashes, of Qin scouts glimpsed between trees, of soldiers crossing rivers with surprising speed. Their word spread, carried by frightened whispers through neighborhoods and temple courtyards. One evening, as the sun dipped behind a veil of dusky clouds, a warm breeze swept through the capital, stirring the chimes that hung from palace eaves. King Huai stood overlooking the gardens, watching lotus petals tremble on the pond's surface. A minister approached quietly and bowed low. His voice, soft but strained, explained that Qin had taken another key location along the western frontier, one more step into the kingdom's vulnerable heart. The king closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the weight of the news. Not with despair, but with a tired understanding. He spoke few words. Only a quiet acknowledgement that carried within it both sorrow and resolve. The minister withdrew, leaving the king alone with the soft rustling of lotus leaves and the distant hum of evening insects. As summer deepened, the rains began their slow, rhythmic descent across Chu. They pattered against the dense canopy, drummed softly on wooden roofs, and filled the marshes until they overflowed into winding channels. The world glowed in muted shades of green and amber. Everything glistened, water dripping from reeds, rippling across rice paddies, pooling around twisted roots. In this warm, rain-soaked landscape, the war moved like a tide, steady, silent, unstoppable. And beneath the humming chorus of insects, the steady fall of rain, and the softened heartbeat of the southern world, the kingdom of Chu felt the quiet tightening of destiny drawing ever nearer, like a hand closing around the final threads of an ancient tapestry. Part 18. As the southern rains continued their steady descent, the kingdom of Chu entered a period of heavy, breath-held anticipation. The humid air wrapped itself around villages and forests like a warm, persistent shroud. Rivers swelled beyond their banks, carrying leaves, petals, and fragments of driftwood in languid currents. The world felt swollen with waiting, as though every drop of water pressing into the soil carried a silent question: how long could Chu endure? In the Qin encampments, the rain posed both challenge and revelation. Soldiers accustomed to the dry northern climate found themselves drenched each morning, their armor slick with moisture and their clothes clinging uncomfortably to their skin. Tents sagged beneath the weight of collected water. Horses snorted and stamped uneasily in muddy enclosures. Yet through it all, discipline held. If anything, the rain deepened Qin's resolve. The men grew patient, adjusting their routines to the rhythm of the storms, rising earlier, drying equipment beneath makeshift shelters, drilling in shorter, intense intervals whenever the rain softened into drizzle. General Wang Jian observed it all with a quiet, calculating mind. The rain slowed movement, camouflaged sound, obscured vision. Chu's wetlands, already challenging, became even more complex under the sky's relentless outpouring. But he also recognized something else. The rain made every step deliberate. Mistakes became immediately costly. And Qin excelled in environments where discipline mattered most. Beneath umbrellas of woven reeds, Wang Jian studied updated reports by the soft glow of lantern light, his steady breath rising in faint clouds against the humid air. Across the waterlogged fields and thick forests, Chu's soldiers weathered the season with a different spirit. If Qin met the rain with stoic endurance, Chu embraced it as a familiar companion. Many of Xiangyang's men had spent their lives in this climate, their bodies acclimated to humidity and shifting terrain. They moved through marshes with practiced ease, their footfalls soft against wet earth, their movements blending naturally with the surroundings. The rain cushioned their steps, muffled their sounds, lent itself to ambush and retreat. And Chu used it well. I picture a small group of Chu soldiers crouched beneath broad banana leaves, listening to distant Qin movements filtered through the steady hiss of falling rain. They exchange glances, barely needing words. One signals toward a narrow passage between two large clusters of trees. Another nods. In a fluid motion, they melt into the foliage, their figures becoming shadows within shadows. When they strike, it is swift and sharp, a reminder that Chu still possessed deep reservoirs of spirit and tactical ingenuity. Yet even as Chu fought with tenacity, the strain of prolonged conflict seeped slowly into the kingdom's core. Supply lines stretched thin. Roads crumbled into mud. Refugees flowing from borderlands increased each week, filling villages and temples with families seeking safety. This influx brought new burdens, mouths to feed, wounds to tend, fears to soothe. In the capital, Shouchuan, the halls that once echoed with music and elegant conversation now carried a quieter, heavier rhythm. Ministers walked with lowered gazes. Courtyard gardens, though still beautiful, felt overshadowed by the weight of uncertain days. King Huai, despite his exhaustion, continued to hold council each morning. The humidity made the air thick, and the hem of his robe often clung damply to the polished floor. Yet he remained composed, his voice steady though tinged with fatigue. Reports arrived of Qin's slow but steady movement deeper into Chu territory. The king listened carefully, nodding at times, pausing at others, his gaze drifting toward the tall windows where rain traced soft patterns against carved wooden frames. Xiangyang entered these meetings with the quiet gravity of a man who had become both shield and anchor for his people. He outlined strategies to delay Qin's progress. Using dense forests to their advantage, steering Qin forces into difficult terrain, reinforcing natural choke points. His words carried not only tactical insight but deep emotional steadiness, something that helped keep despair at bay. His very presence reminded the ministers that Chu was not yet broken. Still, even he could not deny the growing truth, Qin's persistence was a force unlike any Chu had ever faced. In the smaller towns and hamlets between the capital and the advancing Qin forces, life continued with a kind of fragile determination. A mother brushed her daughter's hair beneath the soft shade of a bamboo awning. A fisherman repaired nets under a slanted roof, rain tapping a steady rhythm above him. A scholar sat in his doorway, reading poetry aloud to steady his heart, though the words sometimes faltered in the heavy air. These small human gestures, simple, modest, beautiful, stitched moments of comfort into the fabric of a kingdom under siege. Meanwhile, in the Qin camps, subtle administrative efforts reshaped the land behind their advance. Temporary roads were reinforced with planks. Bridges were built across swollen streams. Scouts mapped every incline and hidden pool of mud. The quiet, methodical nature of Qin's preparation became one of its greatest advantages. While Chu fought with spirit, Qin moved with inevitability. One night, during a rare pause between storms, a hush fell across the Chu encampment near a river bend. Clouds drifted apart just enough to reveal scattered stars, their faint light reflecting in the rippling water. Xiangyang stood alone on a low ridge overlooking the river. His armor, resting on a nearby rack, glinted softly in the starlight. His cloak fluttered lightly in the breeze. I imagine him inhaling slowly, deeply, letting the warm air fill his lungs. Perhaps he thought of the ancient poets of Chu, whose verses tied human life to the rhythms of nature. Perhaps he remembered earlier victories, when the kingdom seemed unshakable. Perhaps he thought simply of the men sleeping behind him, their fates entwined with his own. In that quiet moment, he looked toward the dark silhouette of distant hills and sensed the approaching weight of the next great clash. Across the river, Qin sentries remained at watch, their silhouettes motionless against the faint glow of distant lanterns. The two armies, separated by water and darkness, shared the same night, the same humidity, the same listening silence. Yet the path each followed moved steadily toward convergence. Days later, another confrontation unfolded, a broader, harsher, more demanding battle than the first. Rain soaked the fields. Arrows arced through the thick air. Spearmen fought knee-deep in mud. The forest trembled with the weight of clashing forces. Both sides fought with resilience, precision, and unyielding resolve. When the battle finally quieted, its echo seemed to reverberate through the wetlands for hours. The humid breeze carried with it a sense of something shifting, subtly, inevitably, like a stone beginning to roll down a long slope. And as night enveloped the land once more, the kingdom of Chu lay beneath the weight of gathering uncertainty, holding tightly to its remaining strength while the slow, steady tide of Qin pressed onward through the rain-soaked world. Part 19. In the quiet spaces that followed the second great clash between Qin and Chu, the land seemed to carry a strange mixture of exhaustion and awakening. The rains, heavy for so many weeks, began to ease. Clouds thinned into drifting veils. Sunlight, soft and golden, spilled across forests still glistening with moisture. The marshes exhaled pale mists at dawn, and frogs sang into the warm nights with renewed vigor. Yet beneath this gentle resurgence, something deeper stirred. A shift in the balance of the world, felt more keenly with each passing day. Chu's resistance had not broken, but it had begun to fray. Where once the kingdom stood firmly on its ancient foundations, it now felt the subtle trembling of strain spreading through its territories. Villages still tended fields and markets still opened their stalls, but the conversations carried an undercurrent of apprehension. Travelers moved more carefully, glancing behind them as though expecting shadows to follow. And in the great council halls of Shochuan, the air grew heavier with each message arriving from the front. Xiangyang remained the unwavering center of Chu's defenses. His voice, calm yet resolute, guided the kingdom through choices that had no easy answers. He directed troops toward strategic highlands, repositioned cavalry in response to Qin's subtle advances, and ensured that the morale of his soldiers remained tethered to purpose rather than fear. His leadership provided a kind of quiet, steady warmth, much like a small fire kept carefully alive in a storm. But even he could see what the terrain and the people whispered. Qin was adjusting. Qin was learning. And once Qin learned, it became almost impossible to restrain its momentum. On the Qin side, Wang Jian observed every shift in Chu's strategy with the patience of a man who understood that victory depended more on endurance than on spectacle. He urged restraint. He cautioned against overconfidence. He emphasized the necessity of waiting for the perfect moment. To some officers, this seemed puzzling. The army was strong, the men ready, the path open. But Wang Jian saw past the immediate movement of troops. He sensed the tides beneath the surface. I imagine him sitting within his tent at twilight, studying maps illuminated by the warm glow of a bronze lantern. His fingers traced the curving rivers, the wetlands, the ridges that cut through southern Chu. His eyes, narrowed not in frustration but in thought, register every detail. In the quiet of that space, the faint rustle of canvas and the distant chorus of night insects serve as the backdrop to an understanding that soon, the kingdom of Chu would face a decisive turn. Across the front lines, skirmishes persisted. Some were brief exchanges, arrows released across a clearing, brief clashes in marshy thickets. Others stretched longer, shaped by the stubbornness and pride of soldiers on both sides. Chu's troops fought with fierce familiarity of the land, launching swift ambushes from forested slopes, retreating into waterways where Qin's formation struggled to follow. Qin's troops countered with disciplined cohesion, shielding one another from surprise and advancing with methodical precision. But slowly, so slowly that it almost went unnoticed, the advantage shifted. Every adaptation Qin made tightened its hold a little more. Every defensive withdrawal Chu executed left the kingdom a little more exposed. Step by measured step, the shape of the conflict tilted toward inevitability. Inside Shochuan, the strain on King Huai deepened. He walked the palace halls with a slower gait, hands clasped behind his back as though holding himself upright by force of will alone. Ministers approached him with respectful quiet, presenting reports they could no longer soften. The kingdom's territory was shrinking. Refugees burdened the heartland. Supplies thinned. The treasury strained. And always, the same question lingered unspoken: how long could Chu hold? In the evenings, I picture the king sitting alone in a courtyard, watching lantern light shimmer along the petals of lotus flowers floating in a still pond. The warm breeze rustles the reeds. The scent of damp earth rises gently. The world around him remains beautiful, even serene, yet that beauty feels touched by faint sorrow, as though the land itself understands the approaching change. Meanwhile, far from the capital, the emotional rhythm of Chu's people oscillated between resilience and quiet dread. A fisherman waking before dawn still cast his nets into the river, but his eyes often lingered on the horizon longer than before. A baker kneading dough recalled stories of earlier eras when Chu thrived without challenge, and wondered if his children would know such days. Families gathered beneath the shade of great camphor trees, telling their little ones tales of ancient heroes, their voices full of love but edged with anxious hope. Among the soldiers, stories began circulating of a new phase in Qin's advance. Of Wang Jian consolidating his forces, of reinforcements arriving, of a large-scale maneuver forming like a quiet storm gathering momentum. To Chu's fighters, these rumors stirred equal parts fear and determination. To die defending their homeland was honorable. To see their kingdom swallowed whole felt unbearable. Yet the uncertain mix of these emotions hardened their resolve. One evening, as the sky blushed with the fading colors of sunset, Xiangyang addressed his officers. They stood beneath the wide branches of a sycamore tree, its leaves stirring in the soft breeze. His voice carried through the warm air, not loud, but steady, each word grounded in the gravity of the moment. He spoke of duty, of ancestral pride, of the love that binds people to their land. He did not promise victory, but he promised struggle. He promised resistance that would echo through time, no matter the outcome. His officers listened with bowed heads, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows across their armor. The weight of his word settled into them like a deep, solemn vow. Meanwhile, Qin's encampments hummed with quiet purpose. Soldiers packed their gear with practiced efficiency. Engineers reinforced bridges for heavy transport. Scouts returned with detailed knowledge of routes previously avoided. The army moved with the composure of a great river redirecting itself. Not fast, not chaotic, but with unstoppable determination. And so the land braced once more. The forests, full and green, swayed under the warm winds blowing from the south. Rivers glimmered in moonlight. The humid air wrapped itself around both armies like a heavy curtain. And in that stillness, shaped by endless small sounds, the croak of frogs, the chirp of insects, the distant beat of a war drum, the kingdom of Chu felt itself approaching a turning point that would resonate far beyond the wetlands and forests of its home. By now, every person, soldier, farmer, minister, child, carried the same trembling awareness. The next great movement of Qin's campaign would not be another probing strike or measured skirmish. It would be something larger, deeper, more final. And beneath the wide southern sky, warm and heavy with the breath of summer, Chu waited, poised at the fragile edge of all it had ever been. Part 20. By the time the final great movements of Qin's campaign swept over Chu, the land felt heavy with all that had already been endured. The warm southern air still carried the scent of river water and flowering trees, but beneath that softness there was a quiet, unmistakable ache. So much had been risked. So much had been lost. And yet, for a time, the kingdom still stood, gathering its strength around the last embers of resistance. Qin had not advanced recklessly. Guided by Wang Jian's patience, the armies had moved like a slow, tightening circle rather than a rushing wave. They had waited out the worst of the rains. They had learned the character of the wetlands and forests. They had watched, carefully, as Chu's soldiers shifted, retreated, reinforced. By now, every trail, river crossing, and rise in the landscape had been folded into their understanding. The time for probing was over. The time for conclusion had arrived. I imagine a summer morning, pale and hazy, when the air feels almost thick enough to touch. Mist drifts low over the marshes. Birds stir in the reeds. In the distance, barely visible at first, the silhouettes of Qin banners begin to take shape along the horizon, dark lines against the muted sky. Their movement is steady, almost unhurried, yet the meaning behind each step is clear. Within Chu's remaining strongholds, the atmosphere tightens. Xiangyang rallies his soldiers with the same deep, grounded calm that has supported them through every long day and restless night. He knows the odds. He understands the weight of Qin's preparation. But he also knows that a kingdom's dignity is measured not only in its victories, but in the way it faces its final trials. He chooses to stand, to fight, and to honor the land that raised him. On the day of the decisive encounter, the fields and low ridges of Chu feel as though they are holding their breath. Qin's armies arrange themselves with familiar precision, rows of shields and spears aligning like lines of ink across a scroll. Chu's forces, though fewer now, take their positions with quiet resolve, forming around Xiangyang and the remaining commanders who have stayed faithful to their cause. The first sounds of the battle rise slowly into the humid air, the thud of advancing feet, the creak of leather and wood, the distant calls of officers signaling their lines. Then, suddenly, the clash. Metal meets metal. Arrows arc through the sky. War cries, strained and raw, cut through the thick heat. Yet even in this chaos, there remains a strange kind of order. Qin's discipline holds. Chu's familiarity with the land lends its fighters a fierce, rooted strength. For a while, the outcome is not obvious. There are moments when Chu pushes back, using the folds of the terrain to launch sudden, sharp counterattacks. There are moments when Qin's advance stalls, slowed by mud and undergrowth and the sheer determination of defenders who refuse to yield. But slowly, relentlessly, the tide begins to turn. Numbers, training, preparation, and the long arc of strategy press down on Chu's remaining strength like a slowly descending weight. I picture Xiangyang in the thick of that final struggle, his armor streaked with earth and sweat, his voice still steady as he calls to his soldiers. He fights not only with his blade, but with the quiet, unwavering presence that has guided men through fear more daunting than any enemy. Yet even the strongest presence cannot overturn the momentum of an age already in motion. At last, faced with the certainty of defeat and unwilling to be captured as a trophy of Qin's victory, he chooses to end his life on his own terms, leaving behind a legacy of courage that will echo in the stories of Chu for generations. When word of his death spreads through the ranks, a deep sorrow passes among the soldiers. Some weep openly. Others simply bow their heads. But the battle continues, and with Xiangyang gone, the last central pillar of Chu's military resistance falls away. In the aftermath, the kingdom's final defenses crumble. City by city, fortress by fortress, Chu yields to Qin. Some places surrender quietly, exhausted by years of strain. Others resist until the last possible moment, leaving behind charred gates and silent courtyards where the sound of struggle slowly fades into the soft murmur of wind and water. At last, the land that had once felt like a world unto itself becomes part of the widening territory under Qin's control. Back in Xianyang, news of Chu's fall reaches Yingzheng in the calm hush of his palace halls. He receives the reports with composed attention, absorbing their implications fully. One of the greatest kingdoms in the land, a realm of poets and ancient rituals and wide, fertile valleys, now lies beneath his rule. There is little outward celebration. Instead, there is a quiet recognition that another immense weight has been added to his shoulders. Beyond Chu, only one major kingdom remains. Qi in the Far East. But Qi, having watched the fates of Han, Zhao, Wei, Yang, and Chu, no longer possesses the will to challenge Qin. Its rulers choose submission over ruin. With minimal conflict, its territory slips gently into Qin's expanding borders, like the final piece of a long, complex pattern falling into place. And so, in 221 BCE, after years of campaigns, careful planning, and unyielding resolve, the young king of Qin accomplishes what generations before him had only imagined. Yingzheng stands at the center of a land no longer fractured into warring states, but drawn together under a single, unifying authority. The old title of king no longer feels sufficient to contain what has been created. He takes a new name, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin. From that moment, his work turns from conquest to transformation. He orders the standardization of weights and measures, so that trade can flow more easily across the newly unified realm. He unifies the script so that people in distant regions can read the same characters and follow the same laws. He expands roads that bind the empire together like threads, allowing messages and armies to move with unprecedented speed. He commands the linking and extension of walls in the north, defenses that will later be remembered as part of the Great Wall, winding beneath cold skies like a long, stone breath along the mountains. His rule is strict, sometimes unbearably harsh. Legalist principles shape the empire into something efficient yet unforgiving. Dissent is stifled. Books considered dangerous to order are burned. Scholars who resist his vision suffer for their defiance. The peace he creates is great, but it is heavy, resting on foundations that press hard against the people beneath them. In the depths of his ambition, Qin Shi Huang also turns his attention to death. He seeks elixirs of immortality, consults mystics and alchemists, travels to distant coasts in search of legendary islands where eternal life is said to await. Yet, like every human before him, he remains bound to the quiet truth that no power can escape the final stillness. Beneath the earth near his capital, he has a vast tomb constructed, a place meant to mirror his empire in miniature. Around it, life-size terracotta soldiers are arranged in silent ranks, each face uniquely formed, each figure standing in eternal readiness beneath layers of soil and darkness. Horses, chariots, and officers, an entire ghostly army, waits there, unmoving, under the slow settling of centuries. I often imagine that underground world at night, as it once was in his time, newly completed, the torches extinguished, the last footsteps fading away as the chambers are sealed. Above, the empire he has forged stretches out under the stars. Roads gleam faintly in moonlight. Rivers curve in soft, silver lines. The people sleep in towns and villages that no longer fear the sudden thunder of rival kingdoms at their gates. And there, in the stillness beneath fields and seasons and passing years, the first emperor's Terracotta Army stands guard around him, their silent presence a lasting echo of one man's vast, restless dream. To gather a divided world into something whole, and to leave behind, in the hush of history, a shape that would endure long after his own breath had stilled. As we come to the end of tonight's long and quiet journey, I invite you to let the story settle softly around you, the way twilight settles over a still landscape at the end of a warm day. We have walked together through the shifting valleys and ancient river plains of early China, through courts filled with whispered tensions, through battlefields wrapped in mist and rain, and through moments of profound ambition that shaped the course of an entire civilization. And now, as the echoes of those distant footsteps fade gently into the night, we rest for a moment in the calm that follows understanding. The rise of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, was not a sudden blaze, but a slow, steady gathering of purpose across many years. A fractured land drawn into unity. Countless small decisions forming a great, sweeping transformation. Armies moving with quiet precision. Kings and generals acting out their destinies beneath the vastness of an ancient sky. And within it all, the steady pulse of ordinary lives, continuing through the rhythms of planting and harvest, song and silence, hope and worry. The story of unification belongs not only to rulers and strategies, but to the quiet endurance of people who lived beneath the long shadows of history. As you drift deeper into rest, you might hold a soft image of the empire at its dawn. Roads stretching beneath pale morning light. Rivers glimmering with the soft sheen of early mist. Scholars setting down new characters with careful strokes. Farmers tending newly ordered fields. And somewhere, beneath the earth, an emperor's terracotta guardian standing in timeless stillness, their presence like a breath held through the ages. The world that Qin Shi Huang forged was far from gentle, yet it carried within it a strange, enduring beauty, the beauty of a land finally breathing in unison after centuries of division. The weight of that accomplishment, the serenity and sorrow woven into it, still lingers today in ruins, poems, and silent relics waiting in the dark. Now, as the night deepens around you, allow your thoughts to soften. Let each breath grow slower, smoother, more unhurried. The story has done its work. The world outside can rest. And you, too, can drift gently into sleep, guided by the quiet certainty that the past holds its own lullabies, waiting patiently to be heard whenever you return. Rest well,